you want to start webinar? No, it's okay.
Good morning, Colorado. This is the Colorado Oil and Gas Conservation Commission rulemaking. We are set to get started on day 10, Friday. With that, we're letting people in, and I see we have 95 participants. So, Ms. Larson, we will start as we always do with roll call.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Commissioner Gonzalez.
Here.
Commissioner McGowan.
Here.
Commissioner Mock.
Here.
Commissioner Mesner.
Here.
Commissioner Nanjapa.
Here.
Commissioner Putnam.
Here.
Commissioner Robbins.
Here.
Mr. Chair, you have 7 out of 7 commissioners present.
Excellent. All right. Well, we are, again, sort of ahead of where we have been, which is a great thing after 10 days of rulemaking. Appreciate all of our parties and their involvement with the important work that we're doing. This morning, we have on the agenda the director and staff report for the 600 series. We concluded the deliberation on 400 series yesterday afternoon. As a reminder to our stakeholders, the way that the process that we've developed is we take up each of our rulemaking series in turn. We started with 300 and then 500 and then 400. At the conclusion of witness testimony for each series, we have broadly defined issues amongst ourselves, and then we've debated those issues and provided insights to staff for further development of rules. We will be receiving that back from staff and we'll post that to our website. And then at the conclusion of the last 2 sets, 600 today and Monday and probably some of Tuesday, and then 200, then we would go back and sort of put the pieces of these rules together and deliberate finally on all the rules as a whole. So that's our background introduction. With that, look forward to introducing Director Julie Murphy, who herself and her team are doing a phenomenal job of guiding us through this process. So, Director Murphy, we look forward to hearing from you and your team with a introduction.
Thank you, Commissioners, and thank you, Colorado. Today we launch into the 600 series, and to put a finer point on some of Chair Robbins' points, I'd like to recap a little bit of where we've been, because I think it's important in framing where we are today and what we're here to discuss. If you recall my slides from Monday when we launched into this, not Monday 5 days ago, but Monday 10 days ago, I described this as the decalibron, right? We're in the midst of hiking 414ers and it's an intense experience. I would say that I am certainly feeling those pressures myself. I think the fatigue is real, and yet the work has been astounding in terms of what the Commission has accomplished to date. Also in that presentation, I went through Julie's three overarching issues, right? I am proud to say that I think you have been through 2 of them already, in terms of looking at the interrelationship with the state and local governments, and also looking at cumulative impacts, both in the 300 and 400 series rules. What does remain before you, though, is one of the most important issues, and it's Commission Rule 604 dealing with setbacks. It is a critical rule that has received a deal of attention. It has also caught the attention of the state of Colorado over the course of many of the last years I've worked with the Commission. You will hear even more from the parties today, tomorrow, and next Tuesday, which reflects the importance to the overall structure and the implementation of 181. What I would say is that staff, as we notice the rules, have not changed our position on what we think the appropriate setback is. And that is not to say that we are, that was a conscious choice to let the parties fully brief staff's chosen setback, articulate their positions, and not change in the middle of change course in the middle of the proceedings, meaning people would need to rebrief or take new positions or reevaluate their positions. I think it's critically important that we provided consistency to the parties and to the commissioners on this fundamentally important issue, so that you can understand what Joel and Greg walked through today about, AAG Minor and Mr. Duranlo walked through today on why staff reached the position that it did, that you can hear from all of the parties. You can ask questions of the parties. How did they weigh the evidence? How did they weigh the science? How did they weigh their experience to reach a decision that is appropriate for Colorado? What I will say is that staff considered a wide array of information in proposing Rule 604, including a careful review of the wealth of scientific information, countless hours synthesizing GIS data to conceptualize what densities and distances look like, and dozens of meetings with a wide array of stakeholders to understand their perspectives and viewpoints and how they weighed that same information. At the end of the day, the decision is yours. You have spent weeks poring over hundreds of pages of pre-hearing statements and witness testimony on this topic. Over the next few days, you will hear directly from the parties and ask them questions. We are here as staff, as always, to support you as you explore these important topics. And I will say, so it's a big deal, and we look forward to supporting you as you weigh it. And that is the third of my overarching issues, right? However, so much of the 600 series remains critically important to safety measures in Colorado, and we take the piece in the act of protect public health, safety, welfare very seriously. In the 600 series is where we seek to implement much of it. And with that, I would say next slide, please. So obviously you heard my soliloquy about 604. I won't restate it here, but 602 has received a lot of attention. We think it's important. It's staff for the first time stepping into and requiring operation safety management. I think that this is a critically important function. Mr. Leonard will talk about it at great length. And it's us applying what we have learned about how to prevent safety incidents. 603 secondary containment also is critically important. This is what has kept spills and releases from impacting water, which we heard about yesterday, well, in the 400 series from Mr. Duranlo, which was a bit yesterday and a bit earlier this week. Also Rule 609 with inspection standard. This is to prevent leaks, right? The safety is about preventing incidents, and we take it very seriously, as I think you will hear from our staff today. Next slide, please. So we did propose some late-breaking changes to Rule 609, and Ms. Elise Hazard, who you have not yet met, will be working through those today. And I think that you'll enjoy hearing from her. She has an incredible ability to distill these very complicated engineering techniques into something as simple to understand as a soda pop bottle. And I use soda and pop because some people say soda, some people say pop, but I want to make sure I communicate with everybody. So I just want to flag that these changes are coming, and that Elise will walk you through them. Next slide. And so now let's talk about who you're going to hear from today and on what topics. We're going to start with Mr. Minor, who's going to address a couple of things. One is a further conversation about setbacks and how staff weighed the information. Second, he's also going to talk about our interrelationship with our safety rules and OSHA standards and how they work together, and what that means for us and why we continue to approach and regulate safety. And we think it's absolutely appropriate and absolutely necessary, especially given the strictures of 181. Following Joel will be Mr. Duranlo to talk to you again about the countless hours we spent reviewing GIS data, our own experience, and work with existing, proposed, and other setbacks. Mr. Duranlo will turn it over to Mr. Leonard. And I think Mr. Leonard is a bulk of today's presentation for you because he is our safety expert. He has a ton of experience and passion for this arena. And in staff meetings, as we were working through stakeholder comments, what I remember Mr. Leonard saying most clearly is, we can't go there, this is a safety issue. So there are a number of pieces in these rules that we find critically important. We've worked with industry to work out some of the wrinkles, but maintain the important safety protections that they provide. Some of those include operation safety management, and then updating our standards, especially as it relates to fire, and also hydrogen sulfide. And I know Mr. Leonard will talk about this in some detail, but when we're talking about hydrogen sulfide in the context of the 600 series, it's about protecting people. It's not in the space of, say, the 900 series where we're looking at emissions of pollutants. And so he'll go into more detail about that. And while I'm talking about Mr. Leonard and updating standards, I will say the 600 series relies fairly heavily on nationally accepted safety standards that provide a level of detail and a level of protection for Colorado that we think is appropriate. Mr. Leonard will turn it over to Elise Whittington. I accidentally used a different last name for her, my apologies. And Miss Whittington, again, is one of our rising stars in the integrity group. She's an incredible engineer. She's an incredible human being. She's also a great singer. So someday maybe when we get out of the coronavirus world, we can all go hear her belted out. And again, our integrity team has typically focused on flow lines. COGCC has implemented the most, I think, protective flow line regulations in the country. And we're kind of spilling some of that expertise over into the 600 series as it relates to different pieces of equipment. So Ms. Whittington will present to you a simple discussion of the standards and for types of equipment to maintain their integrity, i.e. protect people's safety, right? And protect the environment from incidences. Ms. Whittington will then turn it over to Mr. Gontadas. And Mr. Gontadas is our Dr. Gontadas, let's be precise. He's one of our PhDs and we're proud of his work. And Dr. Gontadas is our groundwater expert. And while groundwater protection doesn't immediately come forward as like a safety concern, it is, right? Functionally, our groundwater monitoring is designed to identify issues quickly. And also in this instance, much like Bradenhead monitoring, 0 is an important number. If you get a groundwater monitoring sample that shows no impact, that is our best day, and that 0 is critically important. So we continue to feel that improving and broadening our groundwater monitoring system is an important tool available to the Commission to better protect public health, safety, welfare, and the environment. And so with that, I will turn it over to AAG Minor to walk through some of the legal pieces around OSHA, as well as the setback conversation. And we thank you so much for your attention. And my goodness, to have made it to day 10 slightly ahead of schedule is more than I could have dreamed of. And I'm so grateful for the work of you and our parties.
Thank you for that introduction, Director Murphy. We will now look forward to hearing from AAG Minor.
Thank you, Mr. Chair, and thank you, Director Murphy. So as Director Murphy mentioned, today I'm going to first discuss Rule 601, which is the introduction to the 600 series safety rules. Staff have proposed to consolidate 2 separate references that are in the current rules that both reference the Occupational Safety and Health Administration, or OSHA, into Rule 601. For context, the Commission's relationship with OSHA is defined in the Oil and Gas Conservation Act. Specifically, Section 106, Subpart 10 of the Act states that, quote, the Commission shall promulgate rules and regulations to protect the health, safety, and welfare of any person at an oil and gas well, except that the Commission shall not adopt such rules and regulations with regard to parties or requirements regulated under the Federal Occupational Safety and Health Act of 1970. Because of this restriction, staff's proposed 600 series rules, like the current 600 series rules, are intended to protect public safety, including the safety of persons at or near an oil and gas facility. However, staff carefully structured the proposed rules to ensure that they do not impermissibly overlap with OSHA regulations, given the restriction in the Act. So if we could move on to the next slide, please. Next, I'm going to provide you some background about the scientific evidence that staff considered in developing Rule 604. You might be wondering why you're hearing from me, staff's lawyer, about the scientific basis for the proposed setback distances in Rule 604. The reason is that there is a legal doctrine called Chevron deference that applies when an agency must make a regulatory decision based on a rapidly evolving scientific field. So today, I will first discuss the nature of scientific uncertainty, then explain the legal basis for why courts defer to agency decisions that are rooted in complex scientific questions, and finally, explain how staff's review of the scientific literature led it to propose Rule 604. As Dr. Richardson explained yesterday, epidemiological studies of health impacts will always carry some uncertainty by their very nature. Outside a sealed, temperature-controlled laboratory, there's no such thing as a perfect scientific method. The basis for our scientific understanding of many well-accepted concepts in both public health and environmental science is a preponderance of evidence pointing in the same direction from a large number of different studies, each conducted using a different methodology that carries its own unique advantages and drawbacks. Over the next few days, you will hear from numerous parties and their expert witnesses about appropriate setback distances and why they believe science supports their position. It is important to remember that from a scientific perspective, it is possible that all of these parties can present factually accurate information, even if they reach opposite conclusions. It can both be true that robust, peer-reviewed studies have concluded that certain categories of health impacts are likely to exist at certain distances, and that there are fair methodological critiques of how those studies reach those conclusions. That kind of back and forth is normal in every scientific field. It is how science advances. A group of creative and highly qualified scientists conducts the first experiment or study using one method, and then another group of equally creative and qualified scientists identifies drawbacks or uncertainties inherent in that methodology. The next study can then build on the strengths of the original study, learn from the critiques presented by the second group of scientists, and examine the same data or concept with an improved methodology that provides more certain results. This is the way that our scientific understanding of the world moves towards a state that can be fairly characterized as scientific certainty. Staff encourages you to keep this in mind as you hear from the parties and their experts over the next few days. As commissioners, you will get front row seats into the nuanced and technical debates about the advantages and limitations of different methodologies to investigate the potential health impacts of living in proximity to various categories of oil and gas operations. Scientific understanding in this field is advancing rapidly, in part because of the productive disagreements like those that you will hear about over the next few days. But most importantly, staff encourages you to remember that a lack of scientific certainty is not a legal barrier to agencies adopting regulations based on the agency's review of the available scientific evidence. Dr. Richardson explained this to you very eloquently yesterday in her discussion of CDPHE's response to the pandemic. Policymaking frequently requires reviewing evolving scientific data and drawing conclusions that are supported by ongoing scientific investigations, prior to the scientific community itself characterizing a body of evidence as presenting a high degree of scientific certainty. It is for this reason that our judicial system recognizes that expert agencies, like the Commission, must be afforded deference to their interpretation of complex scientific or technical matters when they promulgate regulations to implement a statute. Many of you are likely familiar with the concept of Chevron deference. Chevron versus Natural Resources Defense Council was a 1984 Supreme Court case resolving dispute about how the U.S. Environmental Protection Agency decided to calculate emissions from large industrial sources for purposes of determining compliance with the Federal Clean Air Act. The court considered how EPA made its decision and the critiques of that decision that were presented by the parties. It concluded that EPA's, quote, interpretation represents a reasonable accommodation of manifestly competing interests and is entitled to deference. The regulatory scheme is technical and complex. The agency considered the matter in a detailed and reasonable fashion and the decision involves reconciling conflicting policies. In this rulemaking, you are faced with an equally complex, if not more complex, task than what EPA faced in Chevron. The doctrine of Chevron deference means that because of the inherent challenges in weighing complex scientific evidence, our judicial system will defer to the decision that you ultimately reach, so long as it is rooted in a reasonable interpretation of the evidence. Staff believes that the proposed setbacks in Rule 604 are appropriate under this framework. Throughout the course of developing proposed Rule 604, staff reviewed the growing body of peer-reviewed scientific literature documenting potential health impacts that may be attributable to proximity to oil and gas development, including scientific literature submitted by the parties with their pre-hearing statements and responses. Staff also reviewed setback regulations in other states and in local governments. However, neither the scientific literature nor other states and local governments have reached a single consensus about the appropriate setback distances to protect public health in every instance. The scientific literature in the administrative record that staff reviewed clearly supports the conclusion that there are health impacts likely to be attributable to proximity to oil and gas development. However, staff determined that this evidence does not dispositively or conclusively identify any single specific distance as the appropriate setback to protect public health in every circumstance. Staff also believes that at any given distance, even though health impacts are possible, that doesn't mean that they are unavoidable or that they will occur in every case. Accordingly, staff proposed Rule 604 based on its review of evidence in the record and on weighing the relative merits and critiques of various peer-reviewed studies. Staff believes that proposed Rule 604 is consistent with Senate Bill 19181's changes to the Commission's mission and statutory authority. Specifically, the Act's legislative directive now directs the Commission to, quote, regulate the development and production of natural resources of oil and gas in the state of Colorado in a manner that protects public health. That's at Colorado Revised Statute, Section 3460-102, Subpart 1A. Additionally, Subpart 2.5A of Section 106 of the Act, which spells out the Commission's powers more specifically, directs the Commission to, quote, regulate oil and gas operations in a reasonable manner to protect and minimize adverse impacts to public health. One basis for staff's recommendation for Rule 604, though certainly not the only basis, is CDPHE's 2019 Health Risk Assessment Study, which Dr. Richardson described yesterday. The CDPHE study supports staff's precautionary approach to protecting children's health, provides evidence that staff's proposal is reasonable. Staff recognizes that the methodologies of the CDPHE study have both advantages and disadvantages. I will not revisit that today because Dr. Richardson described the details of the methodology far better than I ever could. Accordingly, staff did not rely solely on the CDPHE study. However, when considering the relative merits of the CDPHE study in conjunction with other evidence in the administrative record, staff determined that the CDPHE study is one appropriate consideration to rely on as a basis for Rule 604. Specifically, staff believes that proposed Rule 604B is appropriate because of the unique sensitivity of children's health. Children have developing respiratory systems that may be more sensitive to some pollutants. Schools and child care centers are obviously areas where children congregate and where concentrated outdoor activity occurs. Staff thus took a more precautionary approach for schools and proposed a longer setback distance in Rule 604B than in Rule 604C. But again, please keep in mind that staff believes the scientific evidence in the administrative record does not dispositively or conclusively identify any single specific distance as the appropriate setback to protect public health with respect to either a school or a building unit. Although a review of scientific health studies was one reason that staff proposed the setback distances in Rule 604B and 604C, it is hardly the only reason. Mr. Duranlo will now explain the additional factors that staff considered when developing the proposed setbacks in Rules 604B and 604C.
Thank you. Good morning, Commissioners. Again, I'm Greg Duranlo, the Environmental Manager here at COGCC. Today, I'll walk through the setback requirements for proposed 604 and show you some examples. Thank you, Assistant Attorney General Minor, for setting the stage. Proposed Rule 604A1 carries forward the well safety setback of 200 feet from the surface hole location of each well to buildings, roads, utilities, and railroads. This is primarily a safety setback meant to address the extremely unlikely event of a rig tipping over. It also ensures access for emergency responders in the event of a fire or other emergency. This setback is reviewed on the Form 2 application for permit to drill, and it is implemented when the well is drilled. Rule 604A2 maintains the setback for wells from surface property lines, but this will now be reviewed and implemented at the time a location is permitted on the Form 2A. In Rule 604B, and based on the body of evidence available for review, staff recommends expanding the current school setback to 2,000 feet for a number of reasons. First, this provides appropriate protection to congregations of vulnerable members of our communities who by their age are more susceptible to health impacts than adult populations, as AAG Minor discussed. Second, providing a larger setback to schools helps alleviate other issues that can adversely affect the welfare of students, faculty, and families of students. Separating oil and gas development from schools prevents unnecessary traffic congestion around the peak drop-off and pickup times at the school. Noise from oil and gas operations can be disruptive to students both in the classroom and participating in activities on school grounds. This setback provides appropriate separation to buffer noise impacts. Additionally, odors from drilling, completion, and production operations can be a nuisance and lead to complaints. The added distance reduces the potential for odor issues and complaints. Third, in 2018 school setback rulemaking, the COGCC and stakeholders agreed that schools did warrant an additional level of protection and larger setbacks than other building units and high occupancy building units. And that increase was carried forward in this proposal. Other provisions in Rule 604B carry forward the processes for identification of school facilities, processes for waivers, and procedures for hearings. In Rule 604C1, staff proposes the adoption of more stringent setbacks to homes consistent with the directive of Senate Bill 19-181 to be more protective. The establishment of a firm 500-foot setback takes what was a de facto setback in our former urban mitigation area rules and makes it a statewide requirement. The prior rule prohibited new wells or production facilities from being sited within 500 feet of a building unit, but only where the location was also sited in an urban mitigation area. Urban mitigation areas were defined as having 22 building units within 1,000 feet of the location, or 11 building units in a 1,000-foot semicircle. The proposed rule does allow for waivers from building unit or surface owners to allow for closer siting if that is appropriate for them. This encourages good relationships with surface owners and the closest residents while providing appropriate protection to all surrounding residents. In Rule 604C2, staff established a density threshold of 10 homes within 1,500 feet of a proposed oil and gas location. The basis for this threshold is a much lower density than previously provided under our urban mitigation area rules, but again, establishes a more protective setback regime. This density threshold allows for the site-specific review of the setting surrounding a proposed oil and gas location and the ability for operators to use best management practices to avoid, minimize, and mitigate potential impacts where the building density is low. This rule makes it clear that careful consideration must be given to siting oil and gas locations to avoid densely developed neighborhoods. Staff also recommends the adoption of a setback to non-school high occupancy building units of 1,500 feet. Staff included multifamily dwellings such as apartment buildings to be included in the definition of high occupancy building unit. It's really important to note that we have also changed the measuring point so that setbacks are no longer measured from a well or production facility, but now from the edge of the working pad surface. This change means that setbacks are measured from anywhere on the pad that oil and gas operations can occur, rather than just at a wellhead that's usually central to the pad. I'm now going to turn to a few images to show how these setbacks are represented. Next slide, please. First, I want to give you an idea of the scale of operations. Pad sizes vary by site, design, operator, and geologic basin. On the west slope, we see locations from 2.5 to 10 acres, whereas in the DJ Basin, the site size range is greater from 4 to 20 acres, and on average, pads are larger than on the west slope. Because some may not be as familiar with acres and the distances that are used in our setback rules, I'm going to go through a few visual examples for you. Here are 2 west slope locations that are each just over 4 acres in total disturbance. Both have been reclaimed down to about 1.5 acres after interim reclamation. This is a fairly typical west slope configuration of a dozen or 16 wells, separation equipment, and a few tanks. Click, please. By way of comparison, the Walmart Supercenter in Rifle is also about 4 acres. Next slide. Here is a typical location in the DJ Basin for 12 horizontal wells. The total disturbance here is about 14.5 acres, including 3.5 acres needed for the modular large volume tanks for freshwater storage during completions. The reasons for the larger footprint include a larger rig necessity and more production facilities, including separation equipment, tanks, and combustion equipment. Click, please. By way of comparison, Mile High Stadium is about 13 acres total. To provide some scale on the perspective of distances used in the proposed setback for Rule 604, we've used some familiar landmarks for comparison. Next slide. The Pepsi Center, where the Avs should be playing Game 7 with the Dallas Stars at 2 o'clock today, and the Nuggets normally play, is at about 500 feet across. Another 500 feet you might be familiar with and might have even run, click please, are the covered lots at Denver International Airport. Next slide, please. Another area you may be familiar with is the 1,500 feet between the steps of the State Capitol building to the steps of Denver City Hall. Next slide. In this slide, we start with a 13-acre hypothetical oil and gas location, click please, which is about 1 Mile High Stadium. We'll put on a 500-foot setback, which is the equivalent of a Pepsi Center. And then the density setback of 1,500 feet is the distance across Civic Center Park. Again, I'm just trying to create a sense of perspective. And now we'll turn to some real-world examples. Thank you. This real-world example shows a 13-acre pad in rural Weld County. And as we turn on the 500-foot setback, we'll see there's no building units within the 500 feet. And going out one more, we'll see that there is one home within 1,500 feet. If we go out a little bit further, we'll see that there are 10 homes between 1,500 feet and 2,000 feet, and a densely developed residential community to the east. This pad meets the setback requirements of the new rules. With this example, I want to show the importance of measuring setbacks from the working pad surface and the significance of the density factor with the 1,500-foot setback. When this pad was permitted under the 2013 setback rules, the setback was measured as 540 feet from the wellhead to the nearest home, just north of the location. Measuring from the working pad surface, as we propose, that distance is 80 feet. In this case, the homeowner is the surface owner and was agreeable to the location. However, the other homes that are within 500 feet of the working pad surface were all outside of the 2013 exception zone for this location. So even with the surface owner's agreement, this location would not meet the 500-foot setback. This is a sparsely developed agricultural and residential area, but due to the number of homes within 1,500 feet, 11 total, this location would not meet the density setback either. Next slide, please. This image looks at a different location near the same group of homes. For this production facility, there are no homes within 500 feet and 8 homes within 1,500 feet. This location meets both the 500-foot and the 1,500-foot density setback. For the record, I did manipulate Google Earth images to create these last two examples. And now I'll turn this over to Mike Leonard to discuss many other provisions of the 600 series rules. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Duranlo. Good morning, Commissioners. I'm Mike Leonard, the Compliance Unit Manager, and I'm here to speak to you today about safety and operations. I have to make a full disclosure. So in addition to the 40-some industry and regulatory experience I shared with you a couple days ago, I have nine years as a volunteer emergency medical technician and firefighter in Cheyenne County, Colorado. I was also a member of that county's local emergency preparedness committee and 911 authority board. Because of my experience in industry and emergency response, I'm passionate for the safety and operation rules. I believe a well-trained employee is a safer employee, and a well-trained first responder is a safer first responder, and a better informed individual is a safer individual. As Mr. Miner described earlier this morning, the Commission cannot directly regulate worker safety. However, staff believes that public and environmental safety begins on site with safe operations. Oil and gas sites are not just accessed by industry workers and Commission staff. Other people such as Department of Public Health staff, in certain cases, local government staff, and in the worst case scenario, first responders may be asked to access these locations. Some of these folks may not be privy to all the nuances of oil and gas operations. So to that end, I'm going to speak to you about safety and operations. Next slide, please. Let's talk a little bit about 602A and B. Staff recognizes that much of the work performed in the industry is done by contractors and subcontractors. To that end, staff believes that the training of these individuals will aid in improving not only safety, but improving compliance with Commission rules by making them aware of those requirements. OSHA does have a program titled Process Safety Management. It's a very complex 13-part program that it requires to aid in safety. However, upstream oil and gas is exempt from that program. Staff believes that if operators incorporate a minimum of 2 of the processes from that program, it will dramatically reduce the number of incidents. Those 2 are a change management program and a pre-startup safety program. So what does that look like? So let's say you build a facility rated at 3,000 pounds pressure and you document all the equipment, all the piping and everything you've used as such. 3 years later, you have a valve that's not working or operating properly. You decide you need to change it. So you write a work order to replace it with another valve that's rated at 3,000 pounds because that's what the specs call for. And you hand it off to your work crew. They go to the supply store and find they can only get a 2,500 pound valve. That valve should work, right? Well, if you have a good program in place, the answer will be no. You'll order the correct valve, replace it, document when it was done and what the valve specs are. Talking about the pre-startup safety program is merely a checklist and process to be followed of what needs to be done in what order with what safety procedures in place each time equipment or a facility is placed into operation. Next slide, please. So staff has encountered operations that could potentially threaten public health, safety, welfare, and the environment. In one instance, a contractor was venting gas near a school. Staff encouraged the contractor and operator to shut the well in and install best management practices to improve the situation, which then was accomplished prior to starting work. The current rules do not allow the director to temporarily cease operations that are potential to the public or environment. So to be clear, this is not a full-blown cease and desist of operations, but a stop and evaluate. And as you can see in the photo shown, a stop and evaluate was implemented prior to the execution of this task, and then the employee's job duties were re-explained to him. Next slide, please. Vandalism and terrorism are on the rise across the country, and they have impacted oil and gas in other areas. These events have the potential for impacts to public health, safety, welfare, and the environment. However, many minor incidents go unreported or are only reported to local law enforcement. Staff does work with some local law enforcement, and recently we began working with the Colorado Information Analysis Center, or KIAC, which tracks events across industries for potential patterns. The KIAC can also relate events from other states to determine if there are patterns. In this light, we're providing an avenue to report and potentially reduce these events. No, go back, please. Thank you. There have been incidents that resulted in damage to adjacent lands. For example, fires that started as a result of oil and gas operations spread to gas lands and range lands, which damaged private property. Staff needs to determine the complete extent of the damage and understand and potentially determine mitigations that would prevent future incidents. For an example, better vegetation control around the edges of location to lessen the chance of fire extension. And as to reporting of hazardous chemical releases, staff believes these events need to be reported to have a better tracking of materials spilled on site. 602J emergency response plans involve that not all first response agencies in the state have the same capabilities. In addition, they may not have any communication with oil and gas operators. Responders may have limited or no knowledge of oil and gas operations. The cartoons depicted may be exaggerations, but I guarantee during critical events, it can seem that they're not far off. Pre-planning is the key to determine what capabilities the operators and the local agencies have, and to establish communication, which is vital during incidents. This planning and coordination shows what limitations there may be on both sides. Then determine what practices and procedures to implement to improve the situation in the event and incident, and to have an open line of communication. These practices and procedures need to include not just on-site response plans, but also area mitigation plans such as evacuation routes and procedures. Next slide, please. The 602M sanitary facilities, the current rule requires the use of sanitary facilities, but staff recommends that we add to this rule that they must be anchored. High winds and other events can cause a tipping of the facility, which really leads to undesirable results. Sanitary waste must be contained and handled properly under public health requirements. Next slide, please. Okay, draft rules 603D, E, F, G, I, J, K, M, and N state that these safety and procedural requirements these rules only require safety and procedural requirements only in designated setback areas. We believe these rules are prudent to apply statewide as they speak to protection of all public health, safety, welfare, and the environment. These rules include such things as well consolidation, pit level indicators, securing of loadout lines, and tank specifications, and others. Speaking to fencing, as with the previously discussed 603 rules, fencing was only required in designated setback areas for wells drilled in facilities constructed after 2009. As you can see in the photos, staff has observed situations in many areas of the state where oil and gas development has been encroached upon by the public through either home building or accessible open trails. It's important to note that many operators have been proactive in installing protective fencing. However, protective fencing has not always been installed. This rule will allow the director to require fencing as needed. Next slide, please. When we talk about access roads in 603L, this rule, like the ones previously discussed, only required maintenance in setback zones. It's obvious that incidents can happen across the state with varying terrain and conditions. Staff believes that adequate construction and maintenance is necessary to allow responders to access in a safe and timely manner. In addition, it will help prevent poorly maintained roads from damaging adjacent lands from runoff or vehicles leaving the main road to get around washouts, causing further damage. Let's talk a little bit about, you're right, stay right there. Let's talk a little bit about 603O, secondary containment. But first, let me define secondary containment. I know you've heard the term several times, so let's just define it. So the tanker vessel walls are the initial or first containment of the fluids. Secondary containment refers to the liners under and the berms. You can see in the photo, these are steel berms, but you can have earthen berms as well, surrounding the tanks or vessels. Its function is to prevent fluids that may leak from the vessel from being released further into the environment until that release can be found and cleaned up. In current rules, there are two separate rules that determine the sizing of secondary containment. One speaks to the requirement in setback areas for tanks installed after 2009. And it requires it to contain 150% of the volume of the largest tank. In other words, if the largest tank is 300 barrels, then containment must be built to contain 450 barrels, not including the footprint of the other tanks in the containment. The second rule is for the rest of the state, and it requires 110% plus precipitation. So again, a 300 barrel tank needs 330 barrel containment plus volume for precipitation. That precipitation needs to be calculated for a maximum rainfall event. Staff believes that for newly built or substantially modified locations, 150% containment will allow for expanded protection with less concern over what rainfall event model to use in calculating sizes. Current rules require an engineered or a synthetic or engineered liner to be placed directly beneath the tank. This can be misconstrued that the rest of the containment does not need the same attention. Ensuring that synthetic or engineered liners are attached to the berms prevents potential leakage at the point of intersection. Next slide, please. So we all use signs every day. Signs are out there to inform, to guide, and to warn us. When required to access locations for whatever reason, these signs and labels do just that. The Commission's had sign rules for many years, and we've moved them over from the 200 series to be more in line to address safety and operations. So as you can see, 605A is not a new requirement moving over from 305G, but staff has added more information, contact information to it. 605B allows the public, or the addition of the public road number to the drilling operation sign allows someone who's not familiar with the area to relay more accurate information when calling in a potential incident. As an example, there have been calls from the public to first response agencies. There may be a fire on a drilling rig. Some of these calls cause the responding agency to be delayed as the road could not be identified by the caller. And on a good note, though, these were not actual fires, but flaring of excess gas during operations. Moving down to 605D, the American Petroleum Institute, the API, has a numbering system whereby a unique number is assigned to each permitted well. These numbers include a state code, county code, and sequence number. The Commission tracks wells by API numbers. Well names by themselves can be a little use to us, as more than one well can have the same names. Wells are not always co-located with their production facilities, And there may be different operators with wells on the same location with the same name. 605D and E help clarify what the exact well is and which wells are being served by a particular production facility. Next slide. We'll talk about hydrogen sulfide a little later, but notifying that it's present gives heads up to the folks that they're on site that there are additional hazards. Obviously, signs become weathered, vandalized, or damaged. Because of the importance of signage, staff believes they need to be replaced in a more rapid fashion. Current rule calls for 60 days. We'd really like to see 30 days. Other requirements inform responders what type and how much fluids in tanks, and that H2S may be present. And a number to the contractor that can be reached 24 hours a day. In addition, we're asking that the information be readable from a distance. During a critical incident, this readability from a distance it's important as it creates a safer buffer to allow for information of exactly what the hazards are. Next slide, please. So as we talk about equipment, weeds, waste, and trash in Rule 606, most of these requirements are not new to the Commission rules. There are some clarifications that have been added. Currently, operators cannot store equipment, vehicles, or supplies not needed for production on location. Operators in the Commission have struggled for years with surface owners storing personal equipment on locations that they have leased to operators. The Commission understands back please, thank you. The Commission understands surface owners wanting to use areas of that location. This draft rule allows surface owners to utilize portions of the location as long as it does not interfere with access, reclamation, or emergency response activities. In 606B, staff has encountered situations where maintenance operations, such as oil changes or engine repairs of mobile equipment, not currently needed for operations at that location. For instance, contractors servicing equipment prior to moving to the next location. These types of operations have the potential to contaminate locations with new and used equipment fluids. And the spillage of these materials may not be reported to allow for adequate cleanup. Next slide, please. And I'd also like to add, most of these pictures were taken by staff, so it's not something we pulled off the interweb. Current Rule 603F specifies that facilities need to be kept free of weeds. There's been some confusion with that because the 1000 series reclamation rules refer to noxious weeds as defined by the Noxious Weed Act. And some have insisted that only noxious weeds be controlled. Staff frequently encounters facilities that have plant species that are not on the noxious weed list, but are commonly referred to as weeds. Therefore, we've added a definition of undesirable plants to the draft to remove that confusion. I think you'll hear stakeholders and in some of the pre-hearing statements have expressed that some of these plants are used for agricultural, for grazing operations. However, more often than not, these plants are left to grow uncontrolled, going to seed, and spreading to other lands becoming a fire hazard. Next slide, please. 606D, trash. Staff recognizes that trash and debris are generated in many operations. Excuse me. It may not be possible to remove material on a daily basis, much like a homeowner's trash is not hauled away. The current rule does not speak to how to maintain that trash. The current rule doesn't speak to how to maintain that trash until it's properly disposed. The draft rule specifies that trash must be properly contained, containers can't leak, and it must be operated to exclude wildlife where required. Next slide. Current Rule 606 is somewhat confusing, as it relays that flammable liquids can be stored within 50 feet if terrain or location configuration does not permit this distance. And then it says equivalent safety measures should be taken. Staff believes that distance is the safety measure, Therefore, there is no equivalent safety measure. In 610H, wellheads and storage tanks are not the only source of potential emissions on locations. Temporary storage tanks, separation equipment, and pipeline equipment are just a few of the other potential emissions points. Removing ignition sources from all areas that may have vapors serves more to prevent fires. And finally, burned areas can collect flammable vapors without regard as to where they are located, and safety measures should not only be required in setback areas. Next slide, please. So before we go on to the rules, let's talk a little bit about hydrogen sulfide gas, or H2S. It's a colorless gas that has a rotten egg-like smell. And it has an odor threshold, or the point when you can smell it, between 0.008 and 0.13 parts per million in air. So it can be detected by smell in very low limits without being a health risk. It's formed by bacteria and can be found in sewers, sewage treatment plants, animal waste, hot sulfur springs, and oil and gas operations, for just a few. It can kill the sense of smell at levels of 100 parts per million, and at 700 parts per million, it becomes immediately dangerous to life and health. It's heavier than air and obviously highly toxic and flammable. It is present in a few areas of the state in oil and gas operations. It's important to note it can be naturally occurring in formations, or it can be introduced from other sources such as contaminated water trucks. Next slide, please. Speaking to draft rule 612A, because H2S is heavier than air, small continuous releases can develop into larger pools. Migrations of large amounts of H2S has the potential to affect nearby residents, travelers on roads and trails, and also wildlife. Preventing releases will in turn prevent the chance for the gas to build in low-lying areas and increase potential for health risks or fire. I'm going to talk a little bit about 612B, C, and D. Bureau of Land Management Onshore Order Number 6 is a standard used by many agencies when working in H2S environments. It does speak to drilling, well servicing, and storage tanks. Our current Rule 607 requires only the filing of this plan when performing well servicing or drilling operations where H2S is or can be expected. However, it does not direct the implementation of any portion of the plan. Therefore, staff proposes 612B, C, and D to implement these requirements. This will also clarify that extra planning and precautions during phases must be taken to prevent potential impacts to the public and the environment. Next slide, please. In 612E, we define that if an operator ever measures H2S in the gas stream in concentrations of 100 parts per million or greater, 100 parts per million or greater at the well, it becomes a designated H2S location. As I mentioned earlier, sites are accessed by various personnel and even potentially by unauthorized people. Because levels above 100 parts per million, because at levels of 100 parts per million, H2S can kill the sense of smell and then becomes readily dangerous. Signage, audible alarms, wind indicators, and appropriate fencing become required safety measures. 612F requires expanded mechanical safety measures to provide for a secondary means to close in a well and monitor storage tanks. The storage tank portion is necessary as H2 levels can grow in storage tanks beyond what was measured in the well and then pose a hazard on the site. H2S is very corrosive to equipment. Metals can be severely impaired by H2S. The Commission must ensure that compatible materials are being used in H2S environments. Current Rule 607C requires reporting of any gas analysis indicating H2S to the director and local government. The draft Rule 612G requires that notice be given to the director and details that reporting is to be done and when. When notice is received by the director will then notify the relevant and proximate local government. This reporting will allow the commission and local governments to ensure safety measures are in place and monitor and tracking of this potential hazard. Next slide. So staff does understand that operations may have to be performed that require the release of H2S gas. For instances where there is a planned release, we believe the need to notify the commission. This notice will allow staff to evaluate the plan and possibly require additional BMPs. For instance, the commission may require alternative measures for release control, or a local government may want to close roads or trails for a period of time. There's also a chance that gas may be released due to an upset condition or equipment malfunction. Staff believes it's prudent to notify the director, local government, and local emergency response agency to allow for follow-up as to the cause of the event. This will also assist in determining if additional best management practice or public notice is required. In 612J, safety equipment must function properly or it's no longer safety equipment. Therefore, it does require proper maintenance. And finally, when a well is temporarily abandoned, and I think Mr. Andrews explained temporarily abandonment with a plug near the formation the other day. When a well is temporarily abandoned, the wellbore and attached surface equipment can be subjected to the corrosive effects of H2S. To prevent this and a possible release, staff believes that the H2S must be contained as close as possible to the source formation. And with that, I'll hand this over to Elise Whittington, OGCC's Integrity Engineer. Thank you.
Good morning, everybody. My name is Elise Whittington. I am in the Integrity Group. I've been with the Integrity Group for almost 5 years. And as Director Murphy mentions, the Integrity Group focuses on regulating flow lines. And flow lines are those pipelines that start at the wellhead and they move the fluid to the wellhead production facilities. They can move fluid to remote facilities as well. Or they can connect to a larger transportation pipeline that can be regulated by other government entities such as the Colorado Public Utilities Commission or PUC, or they can be connected to lines regulated by the Pipeline and Hazardous Materials Safety Administration, which is also known as PHMSA. And Director Murphy also spoke of the changes that have happened in the flowline group. We had a flowline rulemaking last year where we were able to incorporate some of the requirements of SB 181, which leads to the increase of integrity management of flow lines. And we also modified some of our mapping and flow line abandonment requirements, among other things. So I'm a chemical engineer by trade. So before joining the agency, I actually worked downstream as a process engineer at a petrochemical refinery in Houston, where I did a number of things from relief valve sizing and optimizing relief systems. I created simulations of the production units, facilitated several incident investigations. I also did a bit of work with alarm rationalization. So basically the alarms that the operators respond to, rationalizing each one to determine the importance of it, and also did a bit of inspecting, climbed into a few fractionation towers and desiccant dryers. So it is an honor to be here and to be able to give this presentation today. So I'll start off talking about Rule 608. And this contains modified rules that were moved from Rule 605A through E, and also rules moved from 603C in the case of the static charge rules. So along with this modification, the industry standards that were currently in the rules were updated to the most recent edition. And so the proposed rules contain requirements for atmospheric storage tanks, fire heaters, fire vessels and heater treaters, isolation valves, and buried tanks. And Rule 608G applies to the fluid handling equipment that is not covered in the preceding sections. So next slide, please. Okay, so 608A. So the current rules, they require operators to design production tanks in accordance with the applicable API standards that are listed in the rule. And these standards apply to a variety of steel tanks that are commonly used in oil production. However, this rule only applies to tanks that store crude oil. So Rule 608A was clarified to include tanks to store all types of produced fluids, such as produced water, not just crude oil and condensate. In order to avoid corrosion issues, most operators tend to use fiberglass tanks to store produced water. So we added an API specification for fiberglass reinforced plastic tanks to the rule as well. I also want to note that 608A clarified language regarding tank venting, and it added an API standard which covers the normal and emergency venting requirements for above ground petroleum liquid storage tanks that are designed to operate at pressures up to 15 pounds per square inch gauge. And one more thing that I want to note is that I'm going to talk a little bit about back pressure systems, because the current rule in Rule 805B34, it states that closed top tanks shall use a back pressure system that exerts a minimum of 4 ounces of back pressure. And so back pressure systems prevent natural gas from escaping the tank. So if you imagine a soda bottle that has never been opened, this soda bottle, it has the liquid inside, but it also contains carbon dioxide or CO2, and that's what gives the soda its bubbles. So the vapor space within the bottle also has the CO2, but once you remove the cap, you hear that whiff of air, that is the CO2 actually escaping into the air. So the same thing happens when natural gas trapped in liquid reaches atmospheric conditions. And this is what we commonly refer to as flashing. So flashing can occur in a tank, leading to emissions if adequate back pressure is not maintained. And the issue with the current rule is that it only applies to closed top tanks during well completions. So the rule was clarified to apply to sealed tanks used during all phases of operation. So that includes drilling, completion, as well as production and storage. Next slide, please. We also modified the rules regarding fired vessels and heater treaters, because we are aware that storage tanks are not the only potential source of leaks and spills. Corrosion, overpressurization, and mechanical and instrument failures are some of the known causes of spills related to separators as well. So the proposed rule now provides a standard for the design, construction, and maintenance of all separation equipment. Next slide, please. Okay, so this rule talks about special equipment. I'll specifically be talking about valves at the wellhead. So the current rule requires that all wells within 500 feet of a residential building unit be equipped with an automatic pressure control valve that will shut in when a sudden pressure change occurs. So a pressure control valve's main function is to keep the pressure of the flowing fluid as close to the desired set point as possible. So basically, pressure control valves are designed to throttle flow, and it is not recommended that they be used to completely stop flow. Whereas isolation valves have one primary function, and that is to provide a tight shutoff to ensure that the fluids do not pass. So the purpose of this rule is to make sure that the well can automatically shut in case of a sudden pressure change. So therefore, to increase safety, isolation valves will be required within 500 feet. They will be required on a well within 500 feet of a residential building unit. And these valves can be electronic, or they can be activated by a secondary gas source supply. Next slide, please. So the current rules regarding static charge say that rigs, substructures, derricks, or masts shall be designed and operated to prevent accumulation of static charge. Yet these structures are not the only facilities that are prone to static charge buildup. You can have a production facility that has tanks that store a low conductive fluid, and this, as the fluid moves in the tank and as it moves about the tank, that can accumulate static charge. You can also have static charge buildup as wind blows dust particles along the outside of the tank. Another thing to note is that tanks can be prone to lightning strikes as well. So when you have a thunderstorm, clouds build up a positive and negative charge, and the negative charge tends to build up in the bottom part of the cloud, which induces a positive charge on the Earth's surface. So lightning is the result of that transfer of charge from the cloud to the ground. And when you consider the tank height and the tank material properties, it can cause the tank to be a preferable path to ground during a thunderstorm. Lightning strikes at tank batteries and saltwater disposal facilities have resulted in fires over the years, and some operators have had fires, and they want to know what more can be done to prevent them. So to increase safety, the rule was clarified to extend the requirements regarding static charge to all equipment, and it now includes an API recommended practice to protect against hydrocarbon ignition resulting from static charge, lightning, and stray currents. Next slide, please. Okay, I'm going to talk about buried and partially buried tanks. The most common types of these vessels are concrete vaults, fiberglass tanks, and steel tanks. Now, concrete vaults are very affordable and they're effective, but they can be a source of groundwater contamination because the way that they are constructed, they are prone to cracks and the inlets are difficult to seal. Operators also use fiberglass tanks, but they can become brittle over time, which also leads to leaks. In some rare cases, operators can use steel tanks as well, but they tend to avoid that because of the corrosion issues associated with that. So at the end of production life, when the tank battery is being decommissioned and the equipment is being hauled away, historical impacts or evidence that a spill has occurred in the past, historical impacts are commonly found near the buried and partially buried vessels, which requires remediation. The current rules make use of a liner, but the proposed rules require that the liner be impermeable, extended to the surface, and tied to the tank battery secondary containment liner. And I know that Mr. Leonard had spoken on the changes regarding liners in 603. So the liners were not typically installed under concrete vaults, so this requirement may discourage the use of those vaults. If operators are using an impermeable liner or a double wall tank, as the proposed rule now requires or allows you to use, operators could avoid contaminating groundwater, and these changes can help them minimize cleanup in the long run and protect the environment. And one final thing that I want to add is that the proposed rule adds a testing requirement, an annual testing or inspection requirement for buried tanks and vessels. It also requires operators to repair and replace tanks when leaks are discovered. It also requires them to remediate and report as necessary. Next slide, please. Rule 608G speaks of the equipment that does not meet the definition of a tank or a flow line. And so this would include the temporary equipment used during pre-processing. So regardless of the amount of fluid that the equipment can hold or handle, the proposed rule requires that there be secondary containment for this equipment, or that the operator have a written contingency plan for these spills. Next slide, please. Okay, so now I'm going to jump into 609. And this is a new section which contains regulations regarding the inspection of tanks and vessels that are in service. It also covers the out of service tank requirements, and it discusses audio, visual, olfactory, or AVO inspections. Next slide. Thank you. I want to reiterate that Rule 608 is important because it contains requirements and standards that outlines how operators are to design, construct, and maintain their tanks and vessels to maintain structural integrity under operating conditions and handle fluids without adversely reacting to them. But over time, tanks can leak if not inspected. Inspections are a critical part of tank and vessel maintenance because they allow operators to proactively assess the condition of the equipment, and it allows them to address problems such as cracking, vessel wall thinning, corrosion, bad welds, tank imperfections, and other problems that may lead to a spill. So operators, they perform tank and vessel inspections as a part of their best management practices, but the current COGCC rules do not require periodic inspections of storage tanks or process vessels. So several industry standards were included in the proposed rule, which are applicable to the different types of tanks commonly used in production facilities. And instead of adding a specific inspection interval to the rule, operators are required to use the inspection intervals outlined in the most applicable inspection standard. It is also important to note that periodic inspections are required for tanks and process vessels that are in service. So next slide, please. So this means that operators are not required to inspect the tanks that are out of service. However, to minimize the risk of spills, operators are to disconnect or isolate the tank or vessel from sources of hydrocarbon. And these requirements are similar to the COGCC requirements regarding out-of-service flow lines that can be found in the 1100 series rules. So that's where this language is introduced. Operators are to also depressurize and completely empty the tank, ensure that it is tested to be safe for designated entry, cleaning, or repair. And this language originates from the National Fire Protection Association standard for safeguarding of tanks and containers for entry, cleaning, and repair. Another thing to note, to protect wildlife, operators are to equip all openings with a screen or some sort of equipment to prevent wildlife from getting trapped, and operators are to apply the out-of-service locks and tags. I want to note that disconnecting tanks and vessels does initiate the 30-day countdown for operators to conduct a mechanical integrity test or an MIT test on the well. However, if the tank is strictly disconnected for repair or replacement, operators should notify the inspector directly. If an inspector, has already done an inspection and they've added a corrective action to the field inspection report regarding an MIT due to disconnected equipment, operators can inform the inspector of upcoming tank repair replacement plans via the field inspection resolution report. Finally, I want to state that if there's any fluid in the tank or vessel, it is still considered active and it is subject to the inspection requirements in 609. Next slide, please. I'm going to talk about audiovisual olfactory inspections or AVO inspections, and these are inspections that basically involve listening, looking, and smelling for leaks and spills. So the current rules have AVO inspections for some equipment, but not for others. So the proposed rule extends the AVO requirements those requirements to all oil and gas facilities, which complements the requirements established by the Air Quality Control Commission, which is also the AQCC. But for facilities that do not have storage tanks that meet the requirements of the AQCC, operators are required to perform monthly AVO inspections. So as a takeaway, the proposed rules in 608 and 609 can be applied to all types of storage tanks and vessels and fluid handling equipment, regardless of the fluid properties, tank material, and phase of operation. The rules contain standards that can improve construction, design, and maintenance, and provide guidance on periodic inspections most suitable for the given equipment. So now I will hand over the presentation to Dr. Peter Gontadas, and he will continue the 600 series discussion.
Thank you. The next slide, please. I'm Peter Gontadas. I'm an environmental protection specialist with the agency, and as maybe Mike Leonard said, I think we both have about 40 or more years of experience in different parts of the business, but I've been worked in mining and other places and environmental analytical chemistry, and I have a PhD in geochemistry from School of Mines, working mostly in groundwater chemistry or landfill chemistry, the impacts from landfills. And then I've been with the agency for 14 years now, and I've worked in the Raton Basin for 9 years, and it's kind of why I'm doing this part on CBM. And then I've been in the Wattenberg area in Well County for the last 5 years. So let's talk a little bit about what CBM is and why we have some specific rules governing CBM operations, because they are a little different than many of the oil and gas operations in the state. There's a couple pictures there of typical equipment on a pad. That might be all the equipment on a pad, a pump that's electrically driven, some piping, and a shed which has a vertical separator and a meter in it. And then both the water and the gas are pumped away. Can we go back to the other slide for a minute? Okay. The first slide. Okay. Most of the coal bed methane operations in Colorado now are centered in the San Juan Basin and the Raton Basin, so in southwest Colorado and in kind of south central Colorado on the New Mexico border, both basins, and the operations extend into New Mexico. The wells are typically only 1,000, 3,000 feet deep. They were drilled mostly with kind of large water well drilling rigs, not oil and gas type rigs that you see in the rest of the state. And a lot of them were drilled with air as the fluid. And I think earlier in some other sessions, I think Mike Leonard described some noise and dust issues that came from air drilling. Also, CBM is not something, there's not just a bunch of gas there waiting to be obtained. You have to lower the water pressure. Most of the coals are pretty good aquifers. They have considerable amount of water. The natural gas is sorbed onto the coal particles themselves, and unless you lower the formation pressure somewhat, the gas will not come off. So these exist by pumping a lot of water to the surface and kind of what's been called dewatering the coals. And Rule 608 and previous incarnations of that existed in the San Juan Basin, there are a set of orders from 20 years or so ago that 608 was drawn from, see impacts from the dewatering in the sense that the coals were not originally viewed as gas formations, and so they weren't necessarily isolated when deeper wells were drilled in those basins to deeper oil and gas zones. And once some dewatering started, some of the older wells acted as conduits to bring gas up to the surface. Next slide, please. So 614 is a new version of 608. Part of that 608 it required some operators to conduct soil gas surveys at nearby plugged and abandoned wells when they were going to drill, so that we would know if there's gas coming up in places it was not intended to be. This rule simply clarifies that we expect that to be done, not just that there be a good faith effort to make it happen. 608B involved water well sampling. We've consolidated that in this new statewide water sampling rule 615, which I'll talk about in a minute. And next slide, please. Okay. Let's talk a little bit about monitoring around coal mines. That is part of the order in the San Juan Basin from 20 years ago, the orders in La Plata and Archuleta counties. And the same problem was not really seen in the Raton Basin, so it will still exist in the, some of the monitoring of the coal mines will still exist in the San Juan Basin based on the order, because the order supersedes this part of the rule. And also there were some water well sampling requirements beyond Rule 6, what's proposed in 615, when there were oil and gas, older plugged and abandoned conventional wells nearby, and those will still be retained in this rule. The other parts in the new 614 really are not real changes. There's still static bottom hole pressure surveys need to be done, because what we're talking about here is, well, how do you know what the water pressure is down there and if it's been regionally dewatered or not? So new wells that have to have a static bottom hole pressure survey in at least a quarter section, I think. And the Bradenhead testing was adopted really, and it's still in the wellbore integrity rulemaking. It doesn't need to be changed. It was simply drawn through from that in old Rule 608. And there were specific statement in 608 that locally specific orders could be done. There's no real equivalent of that, but that certainly is still the case. It doesn't really need to be in the rule. Next slide, please. Okay, we're trying to consolidate all the groundwater sampling that's been required under rules into one rule instead of having three separate rules, 318 AF, 608 and 609. 318 AF and 609 were adopted in 2013, I think, and 608 has been around since the 2008 rulemaking. And this will simply bring into a common set of data across the state instead of having basin specific or partly specific rules. And after the effective date of the rules, which I was suggested to be December 1st, wells that are permitted or for notice to recomplete after that date will have to comply with 615. The timing of the sampling is suggested in the rule, and for various reasons I'll go into in a minute, is one prior, so baseline, and two post, one at 1 year and 5, and then continuing on through the lifetime of the well every 5 years until the well is plugged and abandoned. And there would be one sample after that, and that would give us 6 or 7 samples in general or more from most wells or well locations. Next slide, please. This is kind of what we envision, 4 water wells being sampled around a new oil and gas well or location. They would be sampled in the time frame we talked about. This consolidates, instead of there being 2 sample locations in 608 and 1 in 318 AF and 4 in 608 or in 609, they would all be 4 water wells to be sampled or attempted to be sampled if they exist within a half-mile radius of an oil and gas location permitted after the effective date. How many sampling events? We've changed that, as I just described, and it's explained there a little bit better. Most of the rules other than 608 did not get us enough data to do statistical evaluation of trends or changes. You had to just look at it and say, and we weren't able to do regional evaluations. Next slide, please. Okay, so the other parts are, one thing we've asked is that we required the use of the same target analytes at each sampling event. Some of the rules changed the subsequent sampling from the baseline, and that's again to give us a better idea that we have a consistent set of analytes that we can look at over time, not changing. And we added some more specific data information of what we wanted with respect to methane and other hydrocarbon gases if present with respect to isotopic ratios and the gas composition. Those are the mechanisms by which we can try to find the source of gas if it exists in a water well. Next slide, please. Okay, what have we done in the past? We have taken statistical evaluation in the San Juan Basin 3 times, I think, 2011, 2013, and 2015, and done this kind of trend analysis. We've used a Mann-Kendall statistical test. It's used to evaluate trends and data collected over time. It's non-parametric. That means it works for all kinds of data distributions. For any of you who have ever worked with geochemical data, it's not usually what's called normally distributed, and most statistical processes are based on some assumption of normal distribution and don't work on this kind of data. But you do need a minimum of 4 sampling events to evaluate trends. In the I asked our database specialist the other day to look up how many wells. At the present, there's about 930 wells in the San Juan Basin with 4 more sets of data. That's from about 1,500 or less than 2,000 CBM wells. And that's because that started 20 years ago with the orders. In the Wattenberg field, we have about 130 wells with 4 more sets of data. We have not really been able to do that kind of statistical evaluation because we just don't have enough data. Most of those 130 are water wells where we or operators have been doing active investigation of possible impacts. It would skew the data in one way or another. We need, it doesn't really matter what the data is, but we want to know that we have some wells in the population that we think are not impacted. So we can do statistical evaluation of trends, which are really needed to look at cumulative impacts. Next slide, please. This is why we want more than one or two sampling types. This is a well that mostly has been sampled by the staff and a couple times by operators. If you look at the top plot there, that's total dissolved solids in milligrams per liter over time over the 16 years that well's been sampled. The lines connecting the dots probably are not meaningful. I just drew them on there to see, but if you had the first 3 sets of data, you'd see a very high increase in TDS. That's kind of a marker of overall water quality. Well, what was going on? You know, if you just saw that, you'd think there's some kind of impact, whether it be from oil and gas, farm operations, whatever, to the water quality. And suddenly there's a deep decrease. And then we see with some further sampling where we did quarterly sampling, we see some seasonality to it. And it appears there's really 2 water sources in this water well. That's something that really can't be dealt with in the statistics anyway, but it's something that we only find out by doing more sampling. But you can't, the Mann-Kendall test is not suitable for statistical evaluation of seasonal trends. It is looking at monotonic trends. Thank you. Next slide. Okay, let's go back to the last 3 rules. The water quality data is required to be put into our environmental database. The operators use a form 43 to get that in there. In e-forms, it automates the transfer of data. The data is not hand transcribed into our database. We use a certain form, we call it environmental, an electronic data deliverable to get it in, that the database can read all the data from the lab directly. Okay, let's go to sampling results. The old Rule 609 said that local governments get it. The data is all available on the website anyway. You can download all the water quality data under the data download set. And then there was a section in 609 talking about liability, and it's really not needed at this point. So it's just been removed. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Dr. Quintana. At this point, Director Murphy, does that conclude staff's presentation?
Thank you for asking. Yes, it does. I know that we presented a large volume of information about safety measures, and I would just reiterate that we feel very strongly that these measures implement 181's directive to protect public health, safety, welfare, with, underscoring that welfare piece and underscoring safety and underscoring environment. So I think that the bigger question of 604 is difficult, and you'll get to wrestle with it. But the safety stuff, we feel like we've really done what's been asked.
Great. It is 10:35. I would suggest we take our morning break. I, for one, as a commissioner, want to go back through my notes and sort of figure out the questions that I have for staff as a result of this excellent presentation. So let's return at 10:50, consistent with our expansion of breaks to 15 minutes. We'll see everybody in 15 minutes. Thanks. To our 174 participants in COGCC rulemaking, we are now at a spot to be able to have questions for our staff that presented so capably to us this morning. I just want to recap what we just heard because it was pretty phenomenal. And I'm going to go backwards from the last speaker to the first, but Dr. Quintanas, thank you so much for your excellent presentation on groundwater monitoring, CBM, et cetera. That's an area that is excellent for us to have heard from. From Ms. Whittington, just a fantastic layman's explanation of highly technical new safety rules around equipment. I mean, can you say soda pop and explain how that works? It was awesome. For context for the rest of our stakeholders, I just want to step back, but you know, with regard to flow lines, we dealt with safety around and created additional safety measures about what leaves a location. And then in wellbore integrity, we have upped the ante and we've dealt with safety around and protection around downhole. So those have already happened with the previous commission. And now with what we're hearing from Ms. Whittington today, staff has expertly demonstrated its vision on making similar safety and protection improvements to equipment at all oil and gas locations. I just find we get lost in sort of the setbacks whirlwind. There is a whole lot that is within the 600 series, and I pivot directly to the excellent presentation from Mr. Leonard. You know, it was a fantastic walkthrough of kind of current state to future state around safety. I mean, Mr. Leonard spoke to dozens of more comprehensive and more protective standards that staff is suggesting to this commission. And again, it's sort of in the setback whirlwind, we sort of lose sight of the dozens of additional protective standards that staff has developed through working with its stakeholders. Mr. Duranolo did an excellent presentation on staff's thoughts regarding setbacks and siting. I really appreciate that. That gets the discussion going. And from AAG Minor, thank you for taking a complex topic such as Chevron deference and elucidating it in a manner that the layman can understand. And I think it really helps set the stage for us as commissioners, now that we know what are the sidebars, how broad those sidebars are, as we listen to the science over the next couple of days. And so really, every agency should get that presentation from AAG Minor before it dives into trying to determine appropriate significant issues based upon science that is deliberative. And Director Murphy, thank you for your leadership in putting together this proposal with your team and for leading your teammates in making great presentations to set the stage for what is going to be a robust couple of days of discussion. So that's my thanks to the team. I now will turn it over to my fellow commissioners for thoughts, comments, questions. We got a lot presented to us and we've got as much time as we need to ask questions of our staff. Commissioner McGowan.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. And hold on a second, I need to. And I think most of these questions are going to be for Ms. Whittington, maybe. In the pre-hearing statements, and I don't know if maybe I just need some clarification. I think in the 608 series, industry was worried about which rules are going to apply retroactively to existing facilities, and in particular, the liquid storage tanks and lining them, and that it may cause more damage than environmental protection, and I wonder if we've addressed that.
Mr. Chair, if I may, before Ms. Whittington weighs in on the technical side.
Yes.
The retroactivity question, Commissioner McGowan, is a bit of a legal question, so I might try answering that. Throughout the entirety of mission change, the staff's intent is for the rules to apply prospectively, not retrospectively, unless it is otherwise specified in the text of the rule or in the statement of basis and purpose. So that's on page 11 of the SPP. You're correct that that many of there are relatively few rules that staff does intend to apply retrospectively, and those are found in the 600 series for the most part. And some of them include the ones that Ms. Whittington talked about, such as Rule 608D on static charge and lightning safety. And then I believe what you were referring to was actually 603O, the secondary containment rule that Mr. Leonard talked about. So Rule 603O does provide that when there's a significant modification at a facility, that will require an operator to essentially retrofit the secondary containment at the facility. So I hope that provides a little bit of clarity, and either Ms. Whittington or Mr. Leonard can weigh in on sort of the technical side of sort of what that significant modification of facility requiring changes to the secondary containment means in practice.
Thank you, AAG Minor, for that setting the stage on that issue. Ms. Whittington. Oh, you're still muted.
I'm so sorry. So I would definitely, when I'm looking at the rule regarding special equipment and isolation valves and talking about the wells that are now to be equipped with isolation valves, the wells within 500 feet of a building unit, it is my understanding that that is something operators are going to have to do. And Mike Leonard, can you attest to that? That is how that is to be considered.
I believe that's the way the rule is written. And Mr. Minor spoke to substantial changes. If they're going to go in and rebuild the whole tank battery, then they need to build it up to today's specifications. If they're just going to change one tank, then no, if that helps.
Commissioner McGowan.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Oops, hold on. So sorry, I just have a couple more questions around. So for the storage tank and vapor control, I think there were some questions again from industry about how we're going to align with the Air Quality Control Commission and who has actual kind of authority over it. And I'm just wondering if we could clarify for everybody how we're working through that so everyone understands.
Mr. Chair, if I may, again.
Yeah.
Sorry.
Thank you. So I'll again kind of address that legal point and then could turn it over to either Ms. Whittington or Mr. Leonard to discuss some of the technical aspects. So I think the rule that you're referring to is Rule 608A. It's somewhere in 608A. It's the back pressure system that Ms. Whittington explained with the soda bottle analogy. And so that is an existing rule. That is existing Rule 805B, and I forgot the subpart, which is where some of our odor standards are found that are really also sort of air quality standards as well. So for the most part, staff moved those existing air quality rules from current Rule 805B to Rule 903, which is where our sort of venting and flaring and air quality rules are found. However, this little component of current Rule 805B that governs back pressure systems, that it's really a safety measure. There are certainly some emissions component to it, but the primary purpose of the rule is really a safety goal of preventing some of the adverse consequences that Ms. Whittington described if back pressure systems are not set up correctly. And as she mentioned, it has also been expanded to include sort of a broader range of operations. So with that context in mind, I would take you back to my presentation on the very first day that staff gave a presentation last Tuesday about overlapping authority between agencies. And it's important to remember that all agencies have the authority that are conferred to them by statutes. The Commission has its authority conferred from the General Assembly through Senate Bill 181 and the rest of the Oil and Gas Conservation Act. And the Air Quality Control Commission has its authority also conferred to it by the General Assembly. And it turns out that some of that authority overlaps, and that is fine. That is something that occurs frequently where air quality might be concerned with emissions from storage tanks because of their instructive to minimize emissions. And the Commission might be concerned about essentially the same types of standards on a storage tank because of our directive to protect safety. That said, it is incredibly important, even though legally it's okay for both agencies to adopt their own rules governing the same standards, for the agencies to work together. And that is exactly what happened. Staff has met, I think, probably dozens of times at this point with staff from the Air Pollution Control Division to talk about the changes to the proposed rule, which for the most part involved Rule 903, but this back pressure system that was part of current Rule 805 is something that staff discussed on at least one occasion with the Air Pollution Control Division, and they are certainly aware of the standard, and I think overall staff has done a great job of coordinating. So that is the legal gloss, and I don't know if Mr. Leonard or Ms. Whittington have anything to add from a technical perspective.
Commissioner McGowan, follow up.
Nope, but a different question. Thank you, Mr. Chair. Sorry, I'm now totally switching gears, and I'm wondering if staff, when they were thinking about setbacks and looking at different studies, whether or not they considered the number of wells on a pad and how much might be emitted and how that might relate to a setback amount.
Mr. Durunlo. It's not 2 p.m. yet, so the ads are not playing.
Thanks. I was trying to find my camera and my unmute. So our setbacks are designed just based on oil and gas location. So it could be one well, it could be a dozen wells, and we felt that it was appropriate to, describe our setbacks from the edge of the working pad surface, encompass all oil and gas activity on that site.
Mr. Chair, I believe Mr. Leonard may have some additional commentary on that point.
Sure, thank you,
Leonard.
Mr. Chairman. Commissioner McGowan, you can't take just the number of wells. You have to take the amount of throughput, the amount of storage, so that's where the risk really needs to be calculated. And you need to take into consideration the production from the well. So I may have 16 wells on a pad, but I may only be producing, a barrel a day, if that helps.
Thank you, Mr. Leonard. Commissioner Messner.
Thank you, Mr. Chair, and thank you very much for that presentation. I do want you to know that that was, while a volume of information, it certainly helped clarify many of the questions that I had going into it so that I don't have to ask those now, and so I really do appreciate that. But inevitably, I have a couple of questions. So first off, and this is just I think, Mr. Durunlo, you had this in your graphics, but I couldn't quite grasp it. And I know that it's a variable, but generally speaking, is there some typical distance between the actual well and the edge of the working pad boundary? And the reason that I ask that is that there's some benefit gained as far as a setback distance from calculating that distance from the working pad boundary versus from the well itself. But I'm just trying to quantify what generally that distance may be.
So thank you for that question. I would say, it's obviously pad size specific. So I mentioned, 4-acre pads on the west slope. Those, I'd have to run math off the top of my head, and I don't want to do that. But obviously you're going to get more of a setback benefit on a 15-acre pad, to those wells. Bear in mind, operators usually design their pads so that the tank battery and production equipment is on the side, which is why we formerly had a rule that said, put near homes, put the multi-well production facilities as far as possible from the home, so on the far side of the location, if you will. You do add 200 feet. You could add as much as 400 feet, depending on the location. And obviously the examples I showed, I did show one 13-acre pad on the in Weld County, and also a 4-acre pad. So, it just really does depend on how the operators are designing things. But yeah, you do definitely gain, hundreds of feet of separation distance from the wellheads themselves, and sometimes even from the production facilities.
Okay.
May I follow that up a bit? And
Director Murphy.
Sure. Thank you. And Greg, please refine this as appropriate. But one of the changes that we have proposed that is important to staff is that we're taking these measurements from the working pad surface and not a particular piece of equipment, because it makes it more consistent in terms of how we're calculating that distance. And also if it was only calculated from the wellhead, we may miss production facilities between the wellhead and the receptor. So that is one of the changes that we feel strongly about in terms of how the measurement should be taken. But the underlying point of your question is well taken.
And Director Murphy, just on that point, I was actually going to follow up with that precise question, is that when we're doing the consideration around setbacks, we're not just focused on setting back from the well itself, but we're focused on setting back from the corollary production equipment, operation equipment that may be on site. And I put a question mark there, Greg, or Mr. Geronimo, in case you wanted to add to that.
No, you're absolutely right. I mean, and oil and gas operations can happen anywhere on the pad. So that could be handling exploration and production waste over on a corner of the pad. It could be siting your combustion equipment on the, on the far corner of the pad. It could be setting your tank battery up, on one edge and the wells on the other. So yeah, it was very important to us to get to get the measurements consistently taken from the edge of the working pad surface. You could think of it roughly as where the sound walls stand up. Anything within those sound walls is where we're measuring from.
Thank you. Commissioner Messner, you still have the floor.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. In generally speaking in 604, I mean, I understand the different categories of setbacks that we're evaluating here. I think a lot of a number of stakeholders in their pre-hearing statements talked about the desire to see setbacks around riparian habitats, wetlands, those types of things. It's not in the current draft, and so I guess I'm curious of thoughts on that.
Whichever staff member wants to take that, unmute yourself. Director Murphy, looks like you're first.
Thank you. Thank you, Chair. Thank you for the question, Commissioner. It is true, staff has not proposed to you a riparian setback. It is also true that a number of parties have brought forward the request for a riparian setback and noted that it is something that the Commission has previously looked at and has said that it would continue to explore over the course of the last decade or so. And so I think it's an important consideration, and if this Commission directed staff, we would bring one back to you that we think is appropriate based on our experience, our knowledge, and also taking into consideration stakeholder and party comments on this topic.
Thank you. I appreciate that. Just from one commissioner, that is something that I'm interested in hearing about. So I will flag that one. Another question I had, and so two different parts. So 604B, one. And so I think we had this discussion in a previous series around the ability for a school governing body to basically grant an exemption for having a working pad surface within the setback. And so, and I think we came to some consensus around the fact that maybe that particular authority may or may not have the expertise to determine whether that's an appropriate exemption to be able to grant. And so I'll flag that one as, something maybe I'll give you guys an opportunity to comment on that and provide thoughts why that stayed in the draft in this particular series. So I'll stop there, and then I have one more other question about C. So,
Director Murphy, did you want to comment here?
Thank you, Chair. And Commissioner Messner, carrying forward the opportunity for a school board to make a decision and waive or otherwise allow for siting within a setback is something that was part of our existing regulatory regime as it relates to schools. That rulemaking was very recent. It was completed in December of 2018. And given its recency, given the engagement that we had on that topic with school boards, operators, local governments, and folks from the community and the environmental communities, we thought that maintaining that opportunity made sense. But again, just like in the alternative location analysis, if that's something that this commission feels differently about, we understand at the staff level. Greg, do you want to add to any of that?
No, that was exactly going to be my point. Thank you with respect to the past rulemaking.
Thank you, Director Murphy and Mr. Duranlo. Commissioner Messner?
Thank you, Mr. Chair. And this will be my last question. So in 604C2, it talks about that no parking pad surface would be located less than 1,500 feet from 10 or more residential building units. And then it talks about unless the commission finds after a hearing that the location could be approved because of conditions of approval or whatever that may be. My question is, how does that tie into or does not tie into the variance process that was set up, that is set up in 502, in the 502 series, or in the 500 series in 502? And the decision whether or not to have that in the 600 series as a section within that rule versus utilizing the variance process to get an exception to the rule. Does that make sense?
AG Minor?
Thank you, Mr. Chair. That is a very important question, Commissioner Messner, and I'm really glad that you asked it because I think that underscores really the way that the variance system functions. So staff thought that this was such an important topic that it was very important to require a commission hearing explicitly in the rule rather than sort of having the standard background you can seek a variance. In some ways, you can also look at it as a variance, right? It's an exception to the normal default rule. But because of its critical importance and because of sort of the centrality of this provision throughout the commission's rules, staff thought that it was more appropriate to specify an individual process here in this rule rather than just allowing the ordinary variance process to apply.
Okay, thank you.
Thank you, Commissioner Messner. Commissioner Gonzalez beat Commissioner Nanjapa by a half a second, so we'll go in that route.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. This will probably be a quick question, but could the staff give us a little bit more clarity on why they chose to distinguish between high occupancy buildings, which may be as small as 4 units, and analogize them or put them in the same category as 10 plus building in that 10 plus building setback? And why not just do it according to the number of building units within a radius? So if there's less than 10 units in one high occupancy building, that's the only thing in the around the perimeter of the well. Why is there that distinction?
Mr. Duranlo.
Thank you, Chair. Thank you for the question, Commissioner Gonzalez. From our experience in evaluating oil and gas locations, we have found apartments to be difficult to count. Difficult to count how many actual residents there are. We feel that it's important to extend the setback to high occupancy building units to those apartments because they are many homes in close proximity to one another, you know, and it just does make it harder to count. Are there 10 apartments in there, or only 9? Or individual apartment units in there, or only 9? There was some talk about, you know, using a larger number of apartment units or dwelling units to count those apartments. What we wanted to distinguish these from is from like a multifamily home, like a duplex or a triplex or a fourplex, which we can reasonably count building units in, and an actual apartment building, you know, where you really do have that just higher density of living space.
Commissioner Gonzalez?
Thank you, Mr. Geronimo. Is there, I guess that I can understand that from the staff's perspective in terms of an evaluation. You know, you're counting the buildings, you're verifying that radius applies. Is there, you know, is there opportunity or any kind of attestation that an operator could do that says, hey, here's the number of units that are within this buffer zone?
Yeah, I still think it's appropriate to treat apartment buildings as high occupancy building units. You know, and another reason that I think I feel strongly about that is that, you know, apartment dwellers don't own their apartment. And so with our rules, you know, we talk a lot about, you know, notices to building unit owners. Now we have extended that to tenants and residents, but I think it's really important that we're not talking about the building, we're talking about the families that live there.
Mr. Chair, if I may add to that.
Yes, AG Minor.
One of the additional reasons for the 4-unit threshold in the high occupancy building unit definition, which is discussed in the SPP, is, as staff did in many other parts of the rules, staff did attempt to align the Commission's definitions with the definitions and standards used by other state agencies and in other state statutes. And part of the basis for essentially setting that 4-unit threshold is the definition, I'm forgetting the exact term, but of essentially an equivalent term under the Colorado Fair Housing Act. And there's a citation to that in the SPP, but that's CRS 2434 set 502.24.
Thank you, Mr.
Gonzalez.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. I've got a couple of non-setback related questions, so I'm going to punt this to Commissioner Nanjapa, who I imagine has some questions more along the lines of 604.
Commissioner Nanjapa.
Hit the wrong button. Thank you so much, Mr. Chair, and thank you, Commissioner Gonzalez. My question is related to setbacks. I just wanted to be sure that I was understanding. So we have these setbacks with respect to the location. The alternative location analysis is only when there's particular triggers that are met. So for example, if the proposed location falls within the specified distance, as we discussed previously, of a DI community, a unit within a DI community, sorry. And then this, obviously, if it was a school or childcare center, that is different for the reasons discussed. And there is, I was just trying to understand the relationship between the alternate location analysis triggers versus specifying the DI community setback here. And also the school board, the school and childcare facility related provisions in the 300 series with respect to alternate location analysis versus here. Can you help me just better understand kind of why certain things are in certain places, or why we don't address them up front?
Director Murphy.
Thank you. So I think that there are a lot of layers embedded in that. And I may try to kind of run through some high level points, see if Joel and Greg have anything to add, and then ask if we answered the different components, Commissioner. And so I think where I would start is to say that one of the criteria for an ALA matches what staff has proposed in its setbacks. Well, not one of the criteria, right? But our school and our residential setback proposed as proposed match what we would be a criteria for ALA. Sorry, I'm tripping over all my words. In the ALA provision, we have also proposed additional criteria for which an operator would submit an ALA, and that is to help us inform and evaluate the proposed location chosen by the operator, what other alternatives there would be, and to help us at the staff level make an informed decision as we review the permit in that context. And so I know that there was discussion during the 300 series and about the ALA criteria about whether those should match the setbacks in 604. And I think that to me is really a decision for the commissioners themselves. We thought it made sense because it helps connect different provisions of our rules. But there are other reasons why you could, disagree with that conclusion, right? It helps line them up. It helps our staff understand what they would be looking to implement in the long run. And we do not have a specific setback for DI communities. And that is something, it depends on how the commission wrestles with the entire 604 setback question about what are the right numbers. And that obviously will be up to you. In terms of the school piece, we thought, again, our current structure provided additional protections for schools. And we wanted to carry that forward, recognizing the sensitivities that both Greg and Mr. Dronlow and AAG Minor walked through this morning around children, and they're required to be there. And there's lots of other pieces, but that is up to you. And then, just touching back on the school board piece, it was important in 2018 for school boards to have the opportunity to engage and make a different decision than what our rules dictated. And so we carried that forward. But I think that to me were kind of some of the global pieces that I heard embedded in your questions. Joel or AG Minor, do you want to add anything?
AG Minor.
Sure, thank you, Director Murphy and Mr. Chair. I think I would just add one thing. Maybe two things. So one is I just want to go back to Commissioner Mesner's question and highlight that this is sort of the situation, what we're talking about here when an ALA would apply as staff have proposed the rules in the relationship between 304 and 604. So if an operator did propose a location that was inside one of the setback distances, right? Say it was within 2,000 feet of a school, then there would have to be a commission hearing to make sure that sort of exception to the ordinary rule applied. And the operator would have to conduct an alternative location analysis to give the commission the tools it needs to evaluate different options in the course of that hearing. So I hope that sort of helps link together why the criteria in Rule 304B to B Romanettes 1 and 2 are the same as the 604 standards. And then I think with respect to the disproportionately impacted community question, I think the way staff approached 604 was setting blanket statewide setbacks with the purpose of protecting public health of all persons without looking a lot at the identity of the persons. And then in the 300 series, staff was more focused on really looking at whether impacts were being concentrated in any one place, right? So using the alternative location analysis as a tool to say, are we actually putting more facilities in a certain area? And is that an area that already has a concentration of polluting facilities and perhaps a more sensitive or vulnerable population, and giving the decision-making tools needed there. So that's why the disproportionately impacted community piece shows up in the 300 series as part of that planning process, but at least as currently drafted, you don't see it in Rule 604.
Thank you, AAG Minor. That was a very excellent question, and I think really pinned this issue of the interrelationship between 300 and ALAs and the 600 sort of protective setbacks. And I'm stealing Ms. Nanjapa's thunder. Did you have further follow-up on that point, Commissioner?
No, I think this is something that I've just been noodling on, especially with respect to disproportionately impacted communities. And, you know, I think all the explanations, and by the way, thank you very much to the staff for the excellent explanations this morning. That was, as others have said, you know, was extremely helpful and answered a lot of my questions. This was the one piece that that I'm still noodling on with respect to, you know, I think there is, you know, a clearer bit of guidance with respect to schools and childcare facilities in both sections, but I'm wondering if we need the same for disproportionately impacted communities. So I'll just say that and then turn it back to you, Mr. Chair.
And I will turn it to Commissioner Gonzalez.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Thank you, Commissioner Najapa, for starting that conversation for me. I've got some follow-ups. I'm still not entirely comfortable or really understanding why the ALAs and the setbacks would be the same, because they're trying to accomplish different things. And I appreciate, you know, the attempt at the explanation on that. But let me clarify this. So if someone is within an ALA radius or within a setback radius, you know, which match up, would they be required to conduct an ALA and additionally request a variance from the commission in order to cite that location?
AG Minor or Director?
Certainly, Mr. Chair, I can try answering that, and then I actually think perhaps Ms. Larson would have additional gloss to provide there. I believe my understanding is that they would not have to separately seek a variance because we structured Rule 604C in a way that there is automatically a commission hearing for any difference from Rule 604C2. So I don't think that the operator would have to include essentially a separate request for relief in their OGDP hearing application, also requesting a variance. But I don't know if Ms. Larson would like to weigh in on that, because she probably is a better person to answer that.
Hearings Officer Larson. Your mic is not on.
I hope that's better.
That is better.
Excellent. So Mr. Minor is correct that the operator would not have to seek a separate hearing on that. Any request for a variance essentially from that rule would be included in their application in the OGDP application and would be taken up by the commission in the course of that application.
Thank you very much.
Other commissioners with questions for our panel. Commissioner Nanjapa.
Thank you, and apologies. I want to make sure that I understood that correctly. So AAG Minor provided the sort of cascade of events that happen. So if an operator is proposing a location that's in one of these setbacks in the 600 series, there would have to be a commission hearing and the operator would have to conduct an ALA, correct? But not request a variance per the question that Commissioner Gonzalez just asked. But if the location was within 200 feet, 2,000 feet of a unit within a disproportionately impacted community, then that would separately trigger an ALA, but there wouldn't be a hearing. Is that correct?
If I may, Mr. Chair.
Yes, AG Minor.
That's almost correct. So there are a list of 10 factors in Rule 304B2B that could require an operator to complete an alternative location analysis as part of their oil and gas development plan submission. I believe 8 of those factors are not aligned with Rule 604. Those are other considerations, and one of those is the disproportionately impacted community. So an ALA would be required there regardless of whether the operator was also essentially seeking, I don't want to call it a variance, but an exception from the ordinary setback rule. There would still be a commission hearing, potentially. So the way that the 300 series is structured, all permits do go to the commission, right? So there's director review and then commission approval. It's possible, I think, in perhaps in some circumstances, and maybe particularly with respect to a sort of modification to an existing location, that might go on essentially the consent agenda. There wouldn't necessarily have to be people standing up and speaking before you. So there would still be commission review. I don't know if I would call that a hearing in every case, but certainly the commission would have an opportunity to oversee each of those permits. And I think because of the sort of sensitive and challenging nature of the topics presented in the ALA, I think it's very, very likely that you would have a full-blown commission hearing on that in each case that there was an ALA being performed.
Thank you, AG Minor. Commissioner Nanjapa, does that answer your question? Do you have follow-up? Do you have other questions?
I think I'm good for now. I appreciate that clarification. Yeah, thank you very much.
Other questions for commissioners? Commissioner Gonzalez.
Thank you, Chair Robbins. So I want to ask about the vehicle maintenance. That was one that kind of stood out to me when I read that one. And I initially thought, like, right now I'm dealing with a vehicle maintenance situation on one of my vehicles. And sometimes it's easier just to fix it and move on versus leave it there, have it towed. It seems to me like it doesn't, the way it's written seems so broad that it would account for something like changing a tire or changing out a spark plug, something that doesn't require any release of fluids around the well site, but could be categorized as vehicle maintenance and would be a lot easier to do with turn a wrench than calling a tow truck and having it towed off site. I just want to make sure I'm aligned with both the intent and the language of the rule.
Mr. Leonard.
Chair, thank you. Yeah, Commissioner Gonzalez, what we've seen in the field, and it's not just changing a tire or changing a spark plug, it's entire engine changes. It's so they'll stack a frac fleet on a pad for a week or two prior to moving to the next job, and they'll go through and service every engine on that whole fleet. And then as they drive away, we find, engine oil on the ground, antifreeze on the ground, things like that. It's these major services that we see not as frequently as we used to, but it does happen. And in places on the Western Slope, operators have built, we call them frac pads. So there's no actual well, but that's where they stage that frac fleet and then they run lines to various wells and frac them. And then they'll get done fracking, they'll service that whole fleet right there on site. And then we end up with this huge cleanup, if that helps.
Mr. Chair, if I may add to that.
Mr. Minor.
I want to follow up on the second part. I think Mr. Leonard did a great job of explaining the intent of the rule, and maybe I can address the language. So I think the key clause there is the second clause in Rule 606B, which says, unless immediately necessary to allow for the continuation of active oil and gas operations. So that does recognize that there is some equipment maintenance that would need to happen, maybe falls more into your wrench category, where like someone's got to leave if their vehicle breaks down, and you can figure that out if there's something that you need to keep the operations ongoing. It's really that unrelated maintenance that's getting the equipment ready to go to another job that the rule is intended to address.
Thank you, Mr. Minor and Mr. Leonard, for that. Yeah, I mean, I read that. I understood what the intent was. I understood what it was trying to get at. But again, the way it was drafted, when I think about maintenance and when I think about the continuation of oil and gas operations, changing a tire on a fleet truck, for a pumper who's there is not continuation of oil and gas operations. So I'm curious if maybe there might be some benefit to maybe clear that up in the SBP a little bit. Just says, hey, this is what we're talking about. We're not talking about changing a tire or anything that doesn't involve, dispersion of fluids from a routine site visit. And so that was just one thing. It's not a big thing, but I think that when we're talking about the rules and getting them right, it's one thing that kind of stood out to me as I was reading them. So I wanted to share that with you, and I'll kind of leave that there. If there's a comment, I'm happy to entertain that. Otherwise, I can move on to my next question. Okay. The next question was about 608E manufacturer standards. right? So applying equipment, installing it, using it, maintain it in a way as the manufacturer instructs. And in my experience, both for the companies that I've worked for, as well as some of the companies that we work or that they worked with, I saw a lot of ingenuity by some of our field engineers with the with the mechanics they were able to fabricate and to put into use. Sometimes it's about finding the appropriate flange that will meet up in a very specific way, or maybe they're shearing off a bolt here or there, and they're like, I can fix this, I can make this better, stronger, safer, and they do so and implement it. And so I'm wondering if 608E it inhibits that at all, or how that would work with something that didn't come from a manufacturer, right? Something that was fabricated for the specific purpose of an application in the field or for use in an oil and gas operation.
Mr. Leonard.
Yes, thank you. And that's a good point, because you're right. I've been one of those guys that fabricated stuff in the field, right? But the idea here is, maybe I can give you a couple, 3 examples. One is pneumatically operated equipment, right? So I've got a dump valve that's operated by well gas or air, and it's got a leak in it, and it's just been leaking forever. That's not operating. It's still working, right? It's still dumping, but it's not operating at manufacturer's recommended specifications. Another example would be using a ball valve or some other type of valve as a choke during a flowback operation, and that's not using that equipment based on manufacturer's operated specifications. Okay, and I do understand that there's those times when things are built that aren't built by Balon or Huber or whoever that are being used. But if you're using a piece of equipment, you need to be using that as specified by the manufacturer within their parameters. That help?
Commissioner Gonzalez, follow up?
Yeah, it does. Mr. Meyer chimed in. Again, this is one of those where I read it, I understand the application, but I see some looseness in there that could potentially, if someone is following that rule to a T and has some better application than is not part of a manufacturer specified piece of equipment, that they may get in trouble. And that's just something that I want to make sure that, again, we're writing these rules in a way that captures as much of that as possible. I know it's not possible to capture all scenarios, but wanted to share that.
Director Murphy.
Thanks. I appreciate the point, Commissioner Gonzalez. I think that we made pretty minor changes to this rule provision from existing rules. And I think that one of the things to keep in mind is that for a number of the instances where things go right in that scenario, we've also seen things go pretty wrong and to create hazards. And so ultimately, I think our recommendation would be that sticking with what a manufacturer recommends for its equipment is the general place we want to be.
Thank you, Director Murphy. Other questions from commissioners? Commissioner McGowan.
Sorry, I'm going to go back to setbacks, and I think I'm still struggling with the differentiation between different setback levels for different levels or numbers of populations. So even though we're saying housing units or whatever, it's really based on how many people. And I think that as we're deliberating and hearing from stakeholders and hopefully from our own staff, that we have a reasoning behind why there's a 2,000 setback for a school. I would argue that most of those kids, hopefully all of those kids, are going to a home at the end of the day. And we would also want them to be protected when they're at their house or their apartment. And so I'm still trying to figure out why we have the 500 foot setback for between 1 and 10 units, and then 1,500 for more than that, and then 2,000 for a school. And so if staff wants to kind of put their thoughts out there as to how kind of this tiered system came to be, I think that that's going to be something I'm really thinking about as we're deliberating and looking at the setback issue.
Thank you, Commissioner McGowan. Director Murphy.
Thank you. So Commissioner McGowan, I think that you have highlighted three questions that the commission itself is going to wrestle with, that all of the parties are wrestling with, and all have opinions and thoughts and guidance for you. So I hope that those parties also bring answers to your questions. I would say that as staff has looked at its rules, we start with kind of the global view of the rules in their entirety and recognize that setbacks is an important component of protection to people, but it is not the only one. And so we want to consider the breadth and depth of the rules in a number of different arenas when we're making these decisions. I think in the school space, again, like it was really critical less than 2 years ago to have increased protections for schools. And at the staff level, we considered that to continue to be good guidance from the commission at the time, from the stakeholders at the time, from the parties at the time. If that has changed, and in me listening to at least public comments, it seems that the public has shifted in terms of in the alignment with what you articulated, Commissioner McGowan, and that children at home and children at school deserve the same level of protection. So I think that's a question for you to answer, right? But what our perspective was is we were told fairly unequivocally school children, when they're at school, needed more protection. And so we carried that forward. In terms of distinguishing between a setback for one building unit versus 10, in our experience, when we're talking about things outside of the public health arena, more in the nuisance space, it can be easier to mitigate or minimize those impacts to a smaller group of humans than it is to 20, right? So if the noise is really problematic, helping move 1 or 2 people away or accounting for sound walls that protect those particular individuals, it's easier to address when there are a smaller number of people. And so that kind of that helped us distinguish between the 1 person versus 10. But again, those are our analyses based on our experience. And I think that there's a lot of information out there and a lot of perspective on this. So,
Commissioner McGowan, follow up? No. Commissioner Putnam has unmuted himself, and then I saw Commissioner Messner raised his hand. We'll go in that order.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. And also had a question just on the distinctions between on the kind of density-based setbacks. In the public health sphere, are there kind of examples that you're thinking about or relying on that would kind of make the distinction between levels of protection just based on population density as opposed to the risk that any particular person would have?
Director Murphy, do you have some staff?
I'm pausing for a moment to see if we have anyone.
Okay.
My inclination is that we were really focused on our experience and our expertise within in-house, and less in the question of what are the right numbers for public health.
AAG Minor or Mr. Durunlo, you both have showed up.
Yeah, thank you, Chairman Robbins. And I would just add that we settled on that 10 number. And, from looking at, as Julie mentioned earlier, kind of poring over GIS data, doing a lot of measurements from existing pads, seeing what was a dense area versus a really sparsely developed area, running numbers on the Form 2As for distances to nearest building units, and really trying to kind of put that together into something that really made sense with our understanding of how those health risks do apply to people, You know, as Dr. Richardson mentioned yesterday, talking about sort of the model with the worst case and the worst case conditions leading to a potential health risk. You know, as you add more potential receptors, then the sort of cumulative risk goes up, and that's, you know, and so just looking at the picture and the landscape, that's how we arrived at that number.
AAG Minor, did you want to take a swing at this as well, or not?
Sure, thank you, Mr. Chair. Maybe I'll give a sort of closing gloss on that, which is to say that what staff tried to do for you today is tell you all the factors that staff considered. And there were a lot of factors that staff considered. And as I said in my presentation, one of those certainly was health and the science. And staff also considered other factors that in some ways staff has more years of experience and data with, such as the nuisance impacts, the incredible GIS database and skills that our team has. And so I hope that answer helps you understand how, as Mr. Dronlow said, staff integrated many considerations into the decision that it made. But ultimately, of course, the choice is yours.
Thank you, AAG Minor. Follow-up, Commissioner Putnam.
Yeah, and I think that's a place that we can certainly address during deliberations, and would be interested in hearing from the public. I agree. I think for some of the nuisance and other sort of areas, and we can use noise as an example, there are often distinctions between more populated and less populated areas. I think for some of our air quality or other sort of standards or toxic standards, they really focus on the risk to a person rather than a kind of cumulative number of people who might be affected. And so, part of the question I think ultimately will be, what's driving the setback, which could be a combination of health, nuisance, and other sort of factors. And, I think that'll be, something important to hear from stakeholders and important for all of us to consider and for you all to decide during deliberation.
Thank you, Commissioner Putnam. Commissioner Messner.
I'll point out to Commissioner Putnam that he gets to deliberate with us as well.
Nicely noted.
I'll be there. I won't miss it.
So a couple of questions. One, and I told you I wasn't going to ask anymore, so I apologize. But so number one is, and this is, I think, a legal question. But in some of these situations, like in 604C1, we utilize the tool of the owner explicitly agreeing to the proposed oil and gas location siting. And, is that a tool that could be contemplated for use in situations further out than that? So we've got this, and I'm certainly curious and open to hearing all different sides on this. And so I'm not making, any comments on thoughts, but these are the things that are going through my head as you've got a situation where you've got some folks that are concerned about equity and application of setbacks and concern around the 1 through 9 residential units compared to the setbacks for residential units of 10 or more. How would a owner explicitly agreeing to the siting play into that situation where you've got folks that have residential units, between 1 and 9? And so my thought is, let's say you had a setback that was 1,500 feet, and between 500 feet and 1,500 feet, you had 8 residential units in there. Currently that's allowed, but you're not requiring that owner explicitly agreeing to that proposed oil and gas location siting between that 500 and 1,500 feet. So is that something that could be implemented? Is it implementable to require that?
If I may, Mr. Chair.
AAG Minor.
Thank you, Commissioner Mesner. I'll try to answer each of those subparts as you presented them. This is a legal question in some ways. There are provisions in the Oil and Gas Conservation Act that's referred to as the Surface Owner Accommodation Section. I believe it's Section 127 of the Act, which I think underscores that the General Assembly does recognize the important role in rights of surface owners. The waiver in proposed rule 604C1 for a surface owner or a building unit owner within 500 feet, that is not required by the statute. That is something that is in current rule 604A1A Romanet 1 that staff decided to carry forward here. It seems to have worked fairly well in the past. To answer your broader question of could that waiver provision be expanded, or could it be a factor that the commission considers in case-by-case hearings on things that fall within sort of 604C2, the broader building unit setback? The answer is yes. Certainly that would be a relevant consideration for the commission to consider at a hearing as currently drafted, or should the commission ultimately decide to do so, at your direction, staff could modify the rule to include sort of a different way of looking at that in a broader context.
Thank you, AAG Minor. Follow-up, Commissioner Messner?
On a different question, and you've answered this question before, but I'm going to ask it again just to kind of partially set the stage for some of the conversations we're going to have later. But you know, one of the things in considerations of setbacks is one, the setbacks that we provide from the COGCC. There's another instance of setbacks where a local government actually authorizes residential land use development closer than our setbacks at some future date, right? And so these are some of the things that that create some of the conflict that we're seeing today. My understanding is, I think based on previous thoughts, is that the state, the COGCC, does not have authority to enforce setbacks from future development from permitted oil and gas locations moving forward into the future. And so to put a little closer point or an example on that, if we say that we are not going to allow something 1,000 feet, I'm randomly picking a number here, so 1,000 feet from so if we cite a site with 1,000-foot setback or a 1,500-foot setback from, let's say 1,500-foot setback from these 3 residential units, and that's the regulations that we have in place at the time, we cannot stop a local government at some point in the future authorizing a subdivision 500 feet from that oil and gas location in the future. Is that correct?
If I may, Mr. Chair.
Minor.
Thank you. Yes, that's correct, Commissioner Messner. This is actually spelled out in Rule 602L, which recognizes that existing production facilities are not expected to sort of retroactively move to comply with future changes in land use. And I think you correctly articulated the distinction between the Commission's authority to regulate oil and gas operations and local government's authority to regulate land use. Those types of land use decisions about where residential building units should go and when are within the purview of local governments.
And this will be an internal conflict until local governments actually make decisions to, maintain some of the setbacks that we'll ultimately decide on. And so I think this will be, something that we should talk about, but acknowledge that, we may do the right thing as far as determining what we think the correct setbacks are, but that could get superseded in the future by a local government essentially eliminating that setback that we put in place.
Further follow-up, Mr. Minor? I think Mr. Messner just sort of re-echoed what you said, and I tend to agree with it, and I appreciate the point and getting it out in front of our 182 participants, that we regulate oil and gas, and local governments regulate land use. So thank you for pinning that flag. Other questions for commissioners? Commissioner Putnam, did you have a follow-up?
I did, and I wanted to change the subject completely and call on Mr. Leonard. As I think I've mentioned before in this commission, one of the concerns at CDPHE has been an emerging class of contaminants known as per and polyfluoroalkyl substances, or PFAS, and has been an area. And I really want to emphasize the collaboration that we've had with COGCC, and especially Mr. Leonard's leadership in making sure that some of those concerns are addressed in both preparation for and emergency response, since one of the primary vectors for that pollutant has been in firefighting foam. So was just interested in Mr. Leonard's perspective on some of the things, how some of the items such as secondary containment will help those efforts. And then also to get his or others' perspective, and that may be Mr. Duranlo's perspective on the need. I know we had some comments on from stakeholders in pre-hearing statement about the desire to have baseline measurements of some of the PFAS compounds, PFOS and PFOA in groundwater, as opposed to testing after the fact, which I know has happened in some circumstances. So I know it's a kind of large issue, but rather than kind of picking one little bit of it, interested in Mr. Leonard's perspective from a holistic perspective about how this will help reinforce, I think, the excellent efforts by staff to address this emerging concern.
Mr. Leonard.
Yeah, thank you, Mr. Chair. That's a good question, Commissioner Putnam. And yes, I do agree. Improved secondary containment will help contain this material when used. And I think part of the pre-planning and preparation is also really important here, as it kind of goes both ways. So again, the operator knows what the local responders have to respond with. So whether that be just water, whether that be with and as you know, there's more than one chain of PFAS, and there's a lot of technology going on today to get away from it. Right now, it's not quite there. There's some protein-based foams that they're looking at, but the problem with them right now is the cooling time. They don't, and I'm going to get a little technical here, they don't stack as well as the PFAS foam, and they don't maintain the vapor coverage. But it truly is the secondary. So it's two-part thing. It's a secondary containment, and it's training and having the responders having the understanding of, we really need to keep that in containment as much as possible. Again, I was a firefighter. I know how easy it is to let that stuff get outside of containment, and it doesn't have to be in all cases. So that's where the planning and pre-planning comes into effect. And Mr. Duranlo, did you want to talk about the sampling?
Mr. Duranlo.
Thank you. Yeah. So with respect to, kind of collecting baseline samples before a site is prepped for oil and gas, if it was an agricultural field turned to oil and gas, or rangeland on the west slope turned to oil and gas, there's no sources for that other than what is found in firefighting foam. So the more important thing to do is, after an incident on a site, to make sure that our staff, working closely with CDPHE's staff, are making sure that appropriate samples are taken, after an incident, to make sure that nothing did leave containment, and if it did, we define the extent of contamination and make sure that it gets remediated. So You know, I think we will definitely be putting guidance together on that, and how to, you know, so that we develop some guidance for operators on how to manage that if they do have an incident on site in which firefighting foam and potentially PFAS containing firefighting foam is used on location.
Thank you, Mr. Duranlo. Follow up, Mr. Putnam.
Yes, thank you. And I again, just wanted to reinforce some of the efforts that COGCC staff has been making with operators to both pre-position non-PFAS foams and firefighting agents in advance to help reduce the need for that, as well as coordinate with us when there are fires to give us reports on whether agents were used, how quickly it was cleaned up and properly disposed of. And it feels like really good attention is being paid by the commission staff and by the operators on this issue right now. I think some of that guidance will help down the road. Kind of like Commissioner Messner's land use question, one variable that the commission doesn't control at the local firefighting departments. You don't control them, and it's ultimately their choice on how they want to fight the fire. And some do believe that it's important to use those agents, and those are places where having the plans in place to clean up, control, and then ultimately test, are important. And I think we're heading in the right direction.
Thank you, Mr. Putnam. I've got kind of a segue follow-up on this whole emergency responded piece. And Mr. Leonard, I know you spoke to this in your testimony this morning, and you spoke to the need for pre-planning, and you also spoke to the need that in certain jurisdictions, they may not have the equipment or capabilities or knowledge of oil and gas. I couldn't find out where that is in the rule, et cetera, but can you sort of explain what we've done from sort of current state to future state around emergency planning once again for me? I kind of got confused.
So yeah, that's a big question. We really haven't required emergency planning.
Yeah, because in general, it's more of a deference to the local first responder, right? And we see emergency plans developed that are synced in with whatever responder is there. But it seems like we're taking a next step in that regard.
Yeah, and I think we are, and it's based a lot on events that have happened recently. Some of my and other staff's experience. We do have other staff that have first response experience, and we see in cases a fire department that shows up that's just undermanned, and it's not their fault. I mean, you get into the rural areas, I guarantee you, it's hard to keep a fire department fully staffed. They're undermanned. They lack training for a number of reasons. You get in the rural areas. They're farmers. They're ranchers. They're not professional firefighters. So what we want to do is the oil and gas industry understands the hazards, and they understand the mitigations that they can do with these hazards. We want them to reach out to the and it's not just the fire departments. We want them to reach out to the EMTs. We want them to reach out to law enforcement especially, because about 90% of the time, the first one on a scene is a law enforcement officer, right? And they are, if it's a fire, they're totally unprepared for what's going on because they don't dress in the funny suits. But what we want to do is get some education out there to say, look, this is what we really need you to do. Fire department, yeah, your job is to put the wet stuff on the red stuff, but wait till we get there, okay? Because you may put out, this is going to sound really bad, but you may put a fire out too soon, and that can cause greater problems down the road. So what we're trying to instill is that education and that communication among those groups. I feel that first responders are the public, so that's public safety. Does that get to your question, sir?
Sorry, I tried to mute myself. Thank you. I may want to have further discussion on this important topic. I see that AAG Minor has also unmuted himself. Did you want to add to this discussion?
Thank you, Mr. Chair. If I may, I want to come back a little bit to your question about the present state versus the proposed state. So as Mr. Leonard said, historically, the Commission has not had rules that did exactly what Rule 602J does, which is instruct operators to have a functioning emergency response plan and to coordinate that with local emergency response agencies. The Commission did take a first step on that path in the wellbore integrity rulemaking in response to one of the SOGR State Oil and Gas Regulatory Exchange recommendations, and adopt sort of a, maybe what we can call a baby version of this rule that I believe just said you have to have a functioning emergency response plan. So what staff has tried to do in mission change is really put a little more guidance out there for operators and really give a little more detail there. And I also just want to underscore what Mr. Leonard said highlights really the importance of all the plans that that staff has proposed in Rule 304C. If you just look at Rule 304C 19 and you see 19 plans, you might miss the broader context of why pre-planning on so many of those topics, including especially emergency response plans, is so important. And staff's goal here was to really do exactly what Mr. Leonard said, to say the best way to deal with an incident is to have a plan for how you are going to address it in advance, and for operators to be developing that direct line of communication Mr. Leonard was talking about with the emergency response agencies. So that tells you a little bit more about the history and the purpose, I hope.
Thank you. That helps as well. Between the two of you, you did a good job of answering that question. Commissioner Nanjapa.
Yeah, thank you very much. Thank you, Mr. Chair, and thank you very much for both the question and the responses. So I'm curious. I really appreciate this notion of the advanced planning and being able to set set forth the intentions. But as you mentioned, with some of the rural areas or smaller municipalities which may not have the appropriate equipment to handle the issues that could potentially arise from whatever operations are being proposed, where does the burden lie? I don't know if this is maybe outside of this section or getting into financial assurances, but does the operator then have to come up with a way to address something that the municipality doesn't have the equipment to cover, or does or what happens?
Mr. Leonard?
Thank you, Mr. Chair. And that's a great question.
Yeah.
It's and I'll just have to dig back into the experiences I've had and the things that I've seen. In many cases, and I've seen it happen quite a few times up here on the Front Range. In many cases, when a fire department, an ambulance service is under-equipped, well, I can't say understaffed because they can't make them get people. But if they're under-equipped or under-prepared, the oil and gas operators have supplied foam. They have supplied equipment. They have bought equipment for those agencies to use. Now that's a double-edged sword, because that department may not be able to maintain that equipment for years to come because it's very expensive. And I'll give you a prime example. Right after 9/11, Department of Homeland Security was developed, and our department was given 800 megahertz radios. Right? It was a great thing. They're very expensive, but they're also expensive to maintain down the road. So there has to be that balance there. There's other situations with fire departments. If this fire department is under-equipped, maybe the mutual aid department has that. So in that plan, if we get a call to an oil and gas facility, that mutual aid department is called automatically. That's where the planning and getting together, so that we're just not running in willy-nilly and making the situation worse. Does that help?
Mr. Chair, could I add a follow-up to that?
AG Minor.
Yeah, I want to highlight that Mr. Leonard's answer pointed out something really important, which is that many operators are already doing this, right? Operators are already coordinating with their local first responders. And that was something that made it a little bit difficult to estimate all the costs and benefits of Rule 602J in the cost benefit analysis. So you look at page 69 of the cost benefit analysis, you can see that staff really doesn't know that how many operators in local emergency response agencies are already coordinating with each other, and sort of what the details of those plans are in terms of additional costs to operators to maybe supply equipment, as Mr. Leonard was talking about. So I think a real benefit of this rule is that we can ensure that there is sort of a systematic statewide coordination, instead of knowing that a lot of operators are already doing it, but not being sure exactly where and to what extent that coordination is happening.
Thank you, Mr. Minor. Follow up, Ms. Nanjapa?
No, I don't think so. I would maybe just pin this though for our discussion and maybe what we hear from others in terms of what might be needed for guidance or other information in terms of addressing that sort of situation. Thank you.
Agreed. Other questions from commissioners to our panel? All right, I'm not seeing any other questions from commissioners.
Mr. Chair.
Yeah, Mr. Leonard, please.
I just realized one other thing. Many, well, maybe many is a strong word, but there are local municipalities and local governments that have enacted rules in oil and gas that say that anytime responders have to respond to an incident on a site, then they have to be reimbursed. So there's another level there.
That's a good point, excellent point. Thank you for putting that out there, Mr. Leonard. Doesn't look like that elicited further questions. Again, we commissioners really want to thank staff for the thoroughness of the presentation this morning, the thoroughness of the 600 series rule set that you have provided to Colorado, and we look forward to hearing from all of our stakeholders with their witnesses, testimony, commentary about the 600 series. And we will do that following our lunch break. I believe that we should convene again at 1:15, and that'll give us an hour for lunch. Thanks, everybody. See you at 1:15.